Outside Memphis, courtiers established households and built temples dedicated to the royal cult in the provinces. This was not a new phenomenon. Sneferu's reign saw the creation of 6 statues of the king for various shrines, and the construction of a line of small pyramids along the lower valley of the Nile. One of the provincial monuments had a royal statue and a table of offerings nearby, while another stood next to a scribal office in charge of state contracts. These simple arrangements suggest that during the time of the colossal pyramids, these kinds of provincial cults served as hubs for getting food and supplies to the people who were building the pyramids. And the court was still in Memphis. This is supported by the fact that some rare reliefs from the same period show that provinces had similar royal cults in the temples at Memphis. Abusir and Saqqara's local temples and shrines were of a different order. Shrines and temples focused on the royal cult, and various state gods consistently upheld this cult across the kingdom. The king issued a decree for the inspector of priests of the god Min in Koptos, a modern town in Upper Egypt, and for all the dependents and possessions of Min's estate, his functionaries, and his entourage. Their Majesty forbids their assignment to the royal works, the cattle or donkey pastures, other animals, the guards, or any other royal duties or tithings. As a matter of principle, King Neferkare, Pepi II, has renewed their exemption from such work. Anyone who sets them to work would be committing rebellion. Neferkare, the king of the valley and delta, whose reign may last forever, erected this document in stone at the Temple of Min in Koptos of the Coptite region, so the functionaries of that region would see it and not take these priests away to work elsewhere. The king himself sealed the document. Excavations revealed plans for 3 local temples in the Old Kingdom. Tell Ibrahim Awad that there are 3 identical shrines in the Nile Delta, Abydos and Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt. Drawn around the shrine of Hierakonpolis, AC signifies the archaeological site on which the later temple stood. Mud brick served as the construction material for all 3 shrines and yielded impressive quantities of well-made artifacts, with the shrine of Hierakonpolis, in particular, holding a magnificent golden hawk in its central shrine, among several other treasures. The shrine houses a magnificent golden hawk, among several other treasures. There may have been more shrines than the number of surviving remains suggests. Over the next millennia, many of these modest structures underwent elaborate overbuilding, resulting in the emergence of some of the most celebrated Egyptian temples, whose inscriptions occasionally recount their humble beginnings. However, the latest did not greatly favor Hierakonpolis, one of the earliest settlement centers in the lower Nile Valley. This led to a considerable clutter of archaic objects in its clustered shrines, such as Narmer's palette. Consequently, the later Old Kingdom monarchs preserved a unique collection of ancient artifacts in the late 1890s. By building and furnishing a local shrine within the prehistoric compound. Archaeologists also uncovered the remains of a fine 4-square local shrine of the later Old Kingdom, at whose center they discovered the golden head of a hawk that once topped a wooden cult image. A carnelian eye in the golden bird's darkly shining eyes gives it an unearthly spark of life in its original position within a narrow mud brick sanctum. Near this shrine, we discovered 2 exquisite life-sized copper statues, one named King Pepi I in its inscription, and the other nameless but identifiable by its iconography as a royal child. These royal images, like their counterparts within Memphite temples, or even the figure of the living king within his palace, must have been the focus of regular rituals. Among the oldest life-size metal sculptures in the world, these 2 sculptures are considered masterpieces of ancient Egyptian art. However, they still have some traces of the pharaoh's living presence. The illicit excavations at several remote locations during the following decades resulted in the discovery of many more such treasures. International antiquities must recover the original locations of numerous remarkable objects, comprehend their ancient context, and understand their significance in the daily rituals of royal rites. That's especially unfortunate because Memphite temples rarely contain similar splendid objects from the royal cult. Nevertheless, their crisp inscriptions and fine craftsmanship still verify a robust royal presence throughout the Lower Nile provinces in the later Old Kingdom, now that they are glittering museum treasures. The history of the gods. Through the statewide diffusion of the royal cult along the Lower Nile, the Memphite court has sustained itself on tithing and offering since its beginnings. As the triads of Menkaure demonstrate, ancient Egyptian gods appeared as members of the pharaonic household, participating in the essential cycle of tithing, offering, and sustenance, just like other members of that extended family. Sustenance. The dust of ruined mud brick buildings exposes such splendid objects, just as their early excavators had observed. We're still determining the origin of these state deities. Undoubtedly, the creation of many of their hieroglyphic attributes, signs, and iconographies during prehistoric times does not necessarily imply the existence of these gods at that time. Like many other faiths, newly made gods accepted these ancient icons as appropriate attributes of their divinity. Many images attest that the hawk was an archaic symbol of royal power. The same ancient image of a hawk was set the name of the first pharaoh, while a later variant, the so-called name of gold, was also placed beneath the image of the royal residence. According to current accounts, Horus made his god debut during the reign of Huni, Sneferu's predecessor, by drawing a hawk's head on his body. In the following century, court sculptors reversed this process by carving a human head on an animal's body. The accompanying inscription identifies Horus as Horus of the royal residence, highlighting his close relationship with the pharaoh. Horus's hands and arms tenderly encircle Khafra's body, like the hawk's wings that encircle Khafra in that most celebrated statue, while their eyes, man and raptor, share an unearthly gaze. Memphite workshops sharply focused on the state gods and gave them human forms from their inception. Those anthropomorphic deities, along with the rest of the pharaonic culture, the offering tables, the nobles' tomb chapels, the pyramids, the regalia and thrones of the pharaoh, and the architecture containing the royal ritual offices, came from the studios of Memphite artisans. According to Dean Hooker, the absence of a science of divine things in those times explains their creation. There is also no evidence that Lower Nile populations worshipped those newly created deities during the Old Kingdom. It's only those elegant synthetic images that come to mind. Many today believe ancient gods were like the frisky deities of Winckelmann's Mount Olympus, or belonged to the so-called primitive religions catalogued by Victorian anthropologists to understand their nature. Yet, one cannot explain the pharaonic deities by labeling them as mythic figures, or gods of this or that, as symbols of life or death. The rising wheat, the sun, or the moon. Even though they had all the contradictions of real people later in pharaonic history, they were neither pseudo-Freudian depictions of parts of human consciousness, nor parts of science that tried to explain the order of the universe by anthropomorphizing things. Champollion, or the modern world, would recognize these early courtly deities as members of a coherent religion. These gods bear no resemblance to Western deities. The relics that have been found show that the rituals performed in their shrines and temples were based on those that controlled the lives of the pharaoh, the royal family, and the people who worked in royal mortuary temples. These gods were fed daily, and later texts, like those about the courtly dead, talked about them in the present tense. With the rising of the sun today, the movement of the wind, the swaying of palms and sycamores, the rhythms of the sun, moon, and stars, and the daily cult and festivals, they rise and move with the sun today. In contrast to earthly members of the royal household, offering them would allow them to live among the dead and in the state's offices for generations to come. Visible and invisible. The existence of two complementary worlds in Pharaoh's kingdom was a prehistoric inheritance. Without the energy that early farmers lavished on their dead, prehistoric settlements would have lost touch with their ancestors, just as modern archaeologists define these early cultures using materials recovered from cemeteries. Excavated graves confirm that early farming communities on the Lower Nile similarly assumed that not all individuals had died when life appeared to have left their bodies, and that their vitality had not yet left the living world and remained a part of their communities. The living had nourished the dead's continued presence by offering and feasting at the graves, ensuring the survival of those unseen aspects of their group. The pharaonic state's activities were shaped by ongoing acts of sacrifice, which included elaborate burial rituals. These sacrifices used the best of the state's resources to build monuments and for the living court and the noble dead. Cults of offerings, daily rituals in the royal palace, royal burials and enthronement rites performed in myriad shadowed shrines throughout the Lower Nile region continuously maintained vital links between the mundane and the mysterious. Some peculiarly modern activities, such as building pyramids and performing temple rituals, are challenging to understand. Categorizing art, religion, and economics is a challenging task. In addition, that affects how we understand the pharaoh's role. According to historians, following the construction of the four colossal pyramids, the generations of Abusir and Saqqara kings would have come into existence if they had ruled by divine rights like early modern European monarchies, or brutally like Old Testament kings, Roman emperors, or even modern dictators. This era of pyramid-building decline must have signaled a weakening of pharaonic power and an increase in superstitious provincialism. Alternatively, the surviving relics indicate a state change. Some had previously been abstract concepts brought into clear focus, while others, like Osiris, made their first appearance. They elaborated and monumentalized the courtly systems that had overseen the construction of the colossal pyramids, and the unseen aspects of that ancient courtly world, with gods like Horus, Hathor, and Re. Abusir temples depicted lion-headed goddesses nursing the kings at their breasts. In the statue groups of Menkaure, Hathor figures placed the pharaoh clearly within a deity group. The court artisans created a majestic intimacy between the images of the king and the impassive feline by carving them in beautiful low relief on the massive stone posts of the temple's doors. Similarly, Tikhna's tomb chapel texts describe the provincial nobles as estate administrators and priests of the now-vanished temple known as the House of Hathor. Hathor was so close to the living king that her name refers to his house. Texts within these chapels record a royal donation of 40 acres to support Hathor's cult's activities through the generations. Priests would have dressed and offered offerings to the goddess as part of her rituals, just as in Memphite temples, and they would have made offerings in the royal name Des. These tomb chapels distinguish between their civil and religious roles by relating epithets to designate them as overseers of priests and provincial lords. Actually, they were aspects of the same social order. Hence, Champollion and many of his successors underestimated the practical gods of ancient Egypt. Pharaoh sat at the center of a vast system of rituals and relationships around the Lower Nile, encompassing every aspect of courtly life and death. Even today, the office of the head of state remains a significant part of the numinosity of the pharaoh's role. As visitors reach the Giza Plateau's foot, they walk up the tarmac road toward the Great Pyramid. In the windy, shimmering strip between the three vast pyramids is a pair of small columned doorways perched on a rocky ridge above the Great Pyramid's northwestern corner. These two tomb chapels, built some 2 centuries after Khufu's nobles laid them out in the Mastaba cemetery, are part of a noble household that flourished after the kings of Abusir. Inti and Mehi's tomb chapels look much like the ruins of dozens of other monuments at Giza and Saqqara, except for the poor stone quality that obscures the weathered reliefs. These 2 restored doorways lead to the largest and oldest chapels within this small group of tombs. Those of their founder, Senedjamib Inti, and his son and successor, Senedjamib Mehi. Two tomb chapels are remarkable because they contain a collage of texts that describe Inti's work at court and give a brief biography. Readers say that Inti and Mehi put them together themselves, and they have 3 passages that are literally translated as royal decrees, but may be thought of more as letters in modern translations. King Sethi, who ruled around 2400 BC, wrote them about building the royal residence. They may be considered letters. King Sethi, who ruled around 2400 BC, sent Inti 3 letters about constructing some buildings at the royal residence. In his letter to the Chief Justice and Vizier, who was responsible for overseeing all the king's works and overseeing the scribes of royal documents, Senedjamib, "My Majesty reviewed it for consideration by the court, for the broad court of the Jubilee Palace of Sethi. Now you say to my Majesty that you've made it 1,000 cubits by 440 cubits by 252 cubits. To the Chief Justice and Vizier, to the Overseer of the Scribes of Royal Documents, and to the Overseer of all the King's Works, Senedjamib, my Majesty has read this letter that you wrote to inform my Majesty of everything you have done in drafting the decoration for the Hathor Chapel of Sethi, which is within the palace grounds. This is the authentic voice of the Pharaoh, a representative who appears detached in the first half of the letter, but ends with encouragement. You are more skilled than any overseer of work in this land has ever been. You have achieved distinction numerous times and will oversee the king's works. You know what Sethi wants better than anyone ever has. I love you. And your innumerable deeds have earned my affection." Another text portrays King Sethi as a prolific writer expressing gratitude for all the accomplishments I had made with his 2 fingers. It appears that Sethi promoted a literary trend in contemporary court society, as another of his letters to a courtier, engraved in his tomb's courtyard, is entirely concerned with the courtier's writing quality. My Majesty has read at court this excellent letter you sent on this fine day to the Chief Justice and Vizier, Overseer of the Scribes of Royal Documents. Ray shapes. Reading your letter was more desirable to my Majesty than anything else, because you certainly know how to express what is most important to my Majesty. And your diction is more pleasing than anything else I have ever heard. My Majesty would appreciate it if you would express your wish in a letter today, since Sethi liver. It is rare to find such letters preserved on their original papyrus sheets or on the stones of tomb chapel walls. Recently, researchers discovered fragments of private correspondence, including 30 from the Old Kingdom in a remote oasis. There were also letters written to the dead that discussed domestic problems that the departed left behind for the living to resolve. The scanty remains of a living state allow us to see what's there. Do their translations and our current understanding of their authors' and recipients' situations inevitably misrepresent their content and tone? The 3rd scene of Year 11 is on the 23rd of the 1st month. The Vizier's letter instructs me, your humble servant, to bring the crew members of the Tura quarries to the western enclosure for clothing fitting in his presence. Since you will be coming to Tura with the barge, I, your humble servant, must spend 6 days at the residence with this work gang before it gets its clothes. Since this work gang only needs 1 day's worth of clothes, your humble servant must improve the work under his charge. I speak to inform you that I am your humble servant. Compared with other surviving pharaonic correspondence, this letter from the Old Kingdom lacks the usual address and is pretty blunt. Perhaps its tone reflects the urgency with which the state's stoneworking gangs had long addressed their tasks. Another graffito, for example, prays for a favourable wind to speed the stone barges. According to one of its translators, the recipient tore the letter in half upon its discovery. Words and writings. In the report, I argued that the item was reasonable and important. The letter originates from Laneham and dates back to approximately 1575. Although modern translations of these archaic letters closely mirror speech forms, it cannot be assumed that they represent the language spoken then. Writing occupied a very different place in pharaonic society than it does today, since other parts of the pharaonic state, even different communities, may have communicated in foreign tongues and in various accents. Only a small minority of the Lower Nile's population was likely to understand the literary syntax that the scribes were developing based on the formal, spoken language of the court. This new written language was made after a long process of encoding the old set of 1,000 hieroglyphs, which were used to keep track of things in the court like names and titles, epithets, year dates, amounts, and types of supplies and artifacts. They refined this process to around 300 signs, expanding their functions to convey information in a linear sequence instead of as standalone lists or labels. At any given time, about 10 tomb chapels were completed for every Old Kingdom courtier whose tomb chapel was made. Thousands of written documents circulated throughout the Old Kingdom court administration. Many amounts that survive are relics of a vanished mountain of writings, whose ghosts appear today in sculptures, paintings, and reliefs as images of scrolls held by priests and scribes. Therefore, this period must have been a time of extraordinary creativity for the writers still representing sentences, or more precisely patterns of speech in groups of hieroglyphic symbols. King-to-courtier texts exemplify warmth, candor, and a certain warmth, yet they adhere to strict propriety regarding tone and texture. This is the literary equivalent of the relationship between the king and the subject in the Abusier reliefs, a formal yet surprisingly forthright bond that will reverberate to the end of that society's courtly air. Beyond those rare literary expressions, it isn't easy to find evidence of the day-to-day realities of a pharaonic government. A popular image of that ancient state today is that the officers of the pharaonic court governed the valley of the Lower Nile, like a modern despotic state. The court controlled the population through fear and propaganda, while enriching itself through brutality and force. Pharaoh's apparent literary warmth might seem crocodile-like. The sparse archaeology and later literary tales of the Old Kingdom cannot substantiate such an assumption. Alternatively, a succession of Habsburg-style dynasties ruled Champollion's Mozartian Orient, the feudal empire where the pharaoh's subjects lived. There is no evidence. However, according to our current knowledge, Pharaoh's Egypt would have benefited from any of those highly developed forms of government. Those archaic images also added resonance to ancient readings of these texts, which lived in a courtly world with hieroglyphs. However, some surviving readers provide brief glimpses of courtly life in the centuries following the construction of the 4 colossal pyramids. We should accept the authenticity of ancient words, yet recognize their inability to align with contemporary sentiments. In 1700, Matthew Prior wrote his memoirs and left high government schemes to his heirs. Between the completion of the Giza pyramids and the reign of the Abusir kings, the courtier Debechni erected his rock-cut tomb and tomb chapel at around 2500 BC, halfway up the Giza plateau, in drifts of sand behind the crumbling quarries. In addition to depicting Debechni's funeral procession in lively and unexpected detail, Debechni's sculptors decorated his tomb with various innovative inscriptions and reliefs. Scholars have visited this now dark and sooty cave since Lepsius, and until recently, groups of men used it for zikrs, hypnotic Sufi prayers performed in unison in honor of a regional saint, Sidi Hamed es-Seman, who once lived within Debechni's pillared halls. This tomb's history of hieroglyphic writing includes 2 incredible novelties. Debechni's funerary chapel's west wall inscribes a list of offerings and images of his funeral. Until the end of ancient Egypt, 94 provisions and accoutrements became the physical components of the rituals performed at the funerals of kings and courtiers alike. Relief carvings in Debeni's tomb chapel at Giza depict funerary scenes. The left side lists the offerings. The cult prepares meat for presentation while images of wild and cultivated animals and birds parade beneath the tomb chapel. The tomb chapel showcases a mostly destroyed statue of Debeni and stores some of these products in pots. There is clapping and singing among the women. Above a dozen rock-cut carvings of the man himself, Debeni's tomb chapel features a somewhat broken wall text. Menkaure, the creator of the last and smallest pyramid at Giza, penned this early example of a biography. The damaged writings of Debeni explain the tomb as follows. His Majesty assigned me this site while he was on his way toward the pyramid plateau to inspect the work on the pyramid named Menkaure is divine. 50 artisans were assigned to the project every day. His Majesty also directed clearing debris from the site and enclosing the chapel with stone from Tura. Additionally, the master of the crew, 2 directors of artisans, and the king's mason and carpenter brought me a post-mortem statue while the stoneworkers constructed a tomb measuring 100 cubits in length, 86 yards, 50 cubits in width, 29 yards, and 100 cubits in height. Debeni's tomb chapel evolved from Khufu's and Hajjadef's huge stone blocks and the spare formalities of earlier tombs. Throughout the following centuries, Debeni's biographical text contained lively descriptions of royal donations and the king's meetings with their courtiers. An inscription in Nyanksekmet's tomb chapel, whose titles indicate that he served as a healer in the royal court, records that Sahure provided him with a false door for his Saqqara mastaba of rough stones. The wrong door of Nyanksekmet stood 10.5 feet high and was carved out of limestone shipped across the river from Tura quarries. Out of proportion to the rest of the monument, or is among the largest ever discovered in the Old Kingdom. Parts of its lengthy text relate how such a remarkable object ended up in an ordinary tomb, beautifully engraved with columns of fine hieroglyphics and images of the healer and his family. In front of His Majesty, Nyanksekmet pleaded for erecting a false stone door for my tomb within the cemetery. He received 2 false stone doors from Tura, and installed them in the audience hall of Sahur Shines with crowns. The 2 high priests of Memphis and the artisans worked on them before His Majesty. His Majesty applied blue paint to the stones daily and completed the stonework. Afterward, His Majesty addressed the chief healer Nyanksekmet. As these my nostrils or me enjoy health, may you depart into the cemetery at an advanced age as one revered. Anything that emanates from his mouth manifests itself. He is more august than any other god. The king daily supervised carving a courtier's false door in the royal palace, demonstrating his interest in the state's primary activities, specifically the construction and decoration of stone monuments. Unsurprisingly, a royal scribe, not the tomb owner, as in Debeni's memoir, penned the text. Despite the scribe's account of creating 2 false doors, the tomb only contains 1 room. During Mariette's exploration of the vast, broad sand plain in the 1850s, a near-contemporary tomb of the courtier Washptar stood near the court healer's mastaba, during which Nyanksekmet excavated his splendid false door and sent it to Cairo and the Cannibal Museum. After Mariette's excavations, Washptar's mastaba, along with several other tomb chapels in the vicinity, had its limestone walls dismantled and its blocks collected by antiquities dealers who supplied museums in Europe and America with examples of Old Kingdom craftsmanship, a period previously little celebrated. In Aberdeen, Cairo, Copenhagen, and London, Washptar's tomb chapel blocks bear vivid inscriptions similar to those of their one-time neighbour, this time describing the dramatic last days of Washptar's life. Inti's tomb at Giza contains texts compiled on the orders of his successor as head of household. It was his eldest son who acted for him while he was in his tomb, so its opening lines are still revealed. According to the broken narrative, Neferirkare, the successor of King Sahur, had been inspecting the progress of Abusir's pyramid with Washptar when the elderly Courtier suddenly collapsed. The king, anxious to find a cure for his comatose companion, bandaged Washptar and brought him to the royal palace. When they informed His Majesty that he was unconscious, they handed him a chest of papers regarding the spasms. The inscription continued, and His Majesty placed a life-giving amulet on his nose and ordered that his body be anointed and prepared for entombment. But all to no avail, as fragments of the broken text continue, and His Majesty placed a life-giving amulet on his nose. A fragmentary inscription depicts a king directing the delivery of a carrying chair to a sick courtier, once again demonstrating his concern and compassion for his close associates. However, Washptar's inscription injects an element of reality into the West's notions of the pharaoh's alleged divinity, due to a description of royal distress. While the king does many things to help his dying courtier, despite his direct appeal to his father, Re, the scribe, carefully records the pharaoh's helplessness and grief as Washptar approaches death. Another memoir describes a courtier's encounter with the same king, Neferirkare, who had shown such care for Washptar, offering additional insight into the pharaoh's esteem. An inscription this time describes Rawa, a courtier intimately involved in royal rituals, whose tomb lies close to Debehnes in the Giza quarries. During a war festival, Rawa encounters the royal presence during a procession. When the prow rope of God's boat was drawn, Neferirkare, the king of the valley and the delta, appeared as the king of the delta. Rawa, as a semi-priest and keeper of accoutrements, followed His Majesty's steps in his office when a royal staff in his hand blocked his foot. "Be sound," said His Majesty. "Rawa is thriving. He will not succumb to defeat. He is my loved one." Rumour has it that His Majesty commanded the inscription on his tomb in the necropolis. People often use Rawa's inscription as evidence of the pharaoh's alleged sacredness. Just as Washptar's texts did not grant the pharaoh the ability to stave off his courtier's approaching death, Rawa's actions are not described as having kicked the sacred staff of divinity, but as merely impeding a state procession's progress. They only beat a courtier's foot when the royal team touched it, citing its sacred presence. His family's simple graves surround the large and straggling mastaba of Rawa, as do many of the courtier's tomb chapels. At least 25 closed rooms were in their stony bulk, specially designed for storing statues. Today, these sculpture rooms are known as serdabs. They have no doors, just narrow slits within their walls that allow the eyes of the figures entombed inside to gaze outward, as well as Rawa's mortuary priests, to make offerings directly to them. Rawa's courtiers usually carried 1 or 2 serdabs in their mastabas, each of which would have held a few statues. However, Rawa's tomb chapel walled up over 100 figures in serdabs, mainly around a central pillared hall. When archaeologist Selim Hassan excavated the remains of the mastaba in the 1930s, he discovered many marvelous fragments of alabaster, limestone, and granite statues, as well as some beautiful wall reliefs. However, unlike Rawa's splendid images, biographical texts rarely provide detailed portraits of the tomb owners. The biographical texts were found near statues of the tomb owners, in tombs like Rawa's and Debehnes. Rawa's inscription was found in one of his serdabs. These texts seem to have accompanied the images in the tomb chapel, similar to how the reliefs show the events that the texts describe. This and later biographical texts mostly talk about events or sequences that show how the tomb owner was related to the king or queen who was still alive, and how he felt personally connected to the man on the throne. This is similar to the court life scenes from that time carved into the Abusir temples. We are fortunate to have these lively documents from an otherwise lost world, that offer alternatives to traditional explanations of life and belief at the Abusir court, which describe the manners and methods of life at that court as credulous and brutal. Their surviving texts, relics, and architecture demonstrate that Pharaoh's courtiers and subjects had remarkable sensibilities and an impressive measure of what anthropologist Gananath Obeyeze-Kere has termed practical rationality. Despite having a common biological inheritance, the Memphite kingdom's culture was self-contained, self-constructed, and a product of its unique environment. Therefore, the difference lies in understanding, as this culture adheres to a different rationale and mode of living than ours. Pyramids after Abusir. Around 2400 BC, Saqqara was an ancient burial ground south of Abusir. In that desert, they built new palaces, settlements, pyramids, and temples for several kings on the plains below. The first to move was Sethi, the letter-writing pharaoh. Locally, it is known as Haram el-Shawaf, the Watchman's Pyramid. This ruined tomb is on a spur of desert limestone about 3 miles south of Abusir, near Shepseskaf's colossal mastaba. As it turned out, Weny and Sethi, the two succeeding kings, set their pyramids a little to the north, near User Kaf's pyramid, and close to the ancient enclosure wall of the Step Pyramid. Despite these relocations, these later pyramids retained much of Abusir's exterior architecture and dimensions. Consequently, the late Old Kingdom pyramids further standardized their interior apartments, with Sethi's design as the model for all subsequent significant pyramids. Dead kings' journeys to their burial chambers began on the sun pavements of the northern face of their pyramids, where a square-sectioned doorway angled sharply down through the living rock to the point beneath the pyramid's apex. Almost 100 feet long and just a yard high, these awkward corridors ran straight down Sethi's pyramid, lined with smooth, polished blocks of Aswan granite. After passing through a second chamber with 3 granite portcullises, the halls entered a square room with a gabled roof. Large blocks of limestone form these beautiful structures, known as antechambers. Significant pyramids are located in central and south Saqqara. We must still map or explore the buried structures and sandstone monuments. A straight line separates the entrance passageway. The corridors lead to 3 small stone chambers, similar to those in earlier pyramids and chambers near the royal shrines, at right angles to the east. These rooms may have stored statues or ritual equipment. If you approach from the west, a low stone doorway gives access to the burial chambers. The magnificent gabled roofs placed the royal sarcophagi at the far end of those narrow rooms. They were cut from tough desert stone with impressive dimensions, but they could only have been installed before the chamber's massive roofing blocks. More than a dozen above each section were assembled. Once the king's interment rites concluded, the royal burial parties scrambled back up the tiny passageways towards the light, lowering the 3 portcullises, and finally paving over the entrances within the open courts. These unearthly subterranean environments, compact, pressured, hot, and muffled in sound, inspired all subsequent royal tombs. Nevertheless, Sethi's successors engraved hieroglyphic columns into the interiors of the pyramids built by Weny and Sethi, Pepi II, Merenre, and Pepi II, and the smaller pyramids of several queens. These various inscriptions make up the pyramid texts. In their day, a historical transformation occurred when monumental inscriptions reproduced written texts, such as King Sethi's letters on the walls of tomb chapels, or the so-called biographical texts of nobles like Debehni and Washptar in courtly hieroglyphs. Although the texts within the pyramids differ from those in Courtier's monuments, their influence has been long-lasting and profound, both inside and outside the pharaonic state. The interiors of all the royal pyramids of the later Old Kingdom follow a similar plan. 2 antechambers flank the entrance corridor, which leads east into 3 small shrine-like chambers, and west to the sarcophagus and the royal burial crypt. Weny's pyramid in central Saqqara houses the earliest examples of pyramid texts carved into the walls. However, it is essential to note that later pyramids have far more inscriptions inside them, and their contents often differ from those of earlier examples. Similarly, their locations in the pyramids gradually expanded until they covered most of the interior rooms and corridors. Until the end of the Pharaonic period, the Lower Nile employed approximately 330 verses in funerary settings. Despite their archaic and often impenetrable prose, their clear and satisfactory carvings are the foundation of all later Pharaonic texts that describe funeral rites and destinies. 10 pyramids are known to have contained pyramid texts. Consequently, the ruins of the pyramids of Pepi the Merenre and Pepi the Kern, along with the pyramid of King Sethi at South Saqqara, have left some of their burial chambers exposed to the sky. A ruined pyramid built after the end of the Old Kingdom for an obscure king named Ibi also has pyramid texts engraved within it. But it is smaller, simpler, and steeper than the Queen's pyramids at South Saqqara. Overlooking a rolling plateau sea of silver palms, a small sandy valley rises from bedrock, separating the South Saqqara pyramid cluster from the rest of Saqqara's cemeteries. Aside from King Shepseskaf's curious mastaba, South Saqqara also contains the pyramids accompanying temples, whose architecture and wall reliefs are modest variations on Abusir's. The South Saqqara pyramids also house several tombs of courtiers and members of their households. However, similar to Abusir's monuments, the lime kilns of the monastery of Upper Jeremiah destroyed much of this large congregation. The half-buried walls and white limestone within their yellow drifts conceal the future of ancient Egypt's buried monuments and wind-blown sand, one of the world's most significant burial grounds. In 2000, researchers uncovered another set of pyramid texts on the walls of a previously unknown Queen's pyramid in South Saqqara. Despite the shattered majority of the limestone blocks used to engrave the South Saqqara pyramid texts, the surviving fragments, preserved within the sand and rubble of their ruined pyramids, remain in excellent condition. The fragmentary nature of their verses, their different versions found in other pyramids, and their sheer literary ambiguity made them perfect academic puzzles. Osiris and King Pepi, responsible for bringing the wind and guiding the north wind, reside in your cavern. Waves of water wash over them. Divine offerings descend. Men praise, and the hearts of the gods rejoice. In modern times, the ruins of some of the South Saqqara pyramids revealed the first fragments of the pyramid texts. So devastated that Mariette mistakenly believed they were pieces of relief from plundering mastaba. However, the opening of Wenis's pyramid in 1881, with its pristine interior walls adorned with 900 long columns of hieroglyphs, confirmed the discovery that Old Kingdom pyramids had texts engraved within them after Abusir. As Reisner's excavators first entered Senedjimib Inti's plunder chamber in November 1913, the courtier was still lying inside a heavy grey granite sarcophagus bearing his name. Despite the robbery, it was a simple burial, with a mummified corpse lying on its back with imported ointments and a single magnificent staff, perhaps a sign of Senedjimib Inti's role in court. In addition to being primarily rough quarried caverns, these funerary crypts were cut from poor and often fractured desert rock, so they had to be exceptionally prepared before texts could be set within them. During the succeeding reigns, it became common practice to smooth those rough surfaces altogether, or erect whole stone or mud brick walls within them to apply the decoration. Therefore, they placed texts in the interior of Wenis's pyramid. Although they followed these courtly trends because they had the resources of the entire state machine, they were grander and more complex than previous examples. A corridor leading into Senedjimib Inti's burial chamber runs straight down into the living rock, similar to the entrance to King Sesi's nearby pyramid. This passageway is an innovation, as most earlier nobles' tombs had been located at the bottom of vertical shafts. The entrance corridor descends to the burial crypt, through an antechamber painted with subterranean text and a list of offerings. Debechny's tomb chapel has already inscribed parts of this standard list on its walls, while earlier, shorter examples showcase some of the earliest examples of hieroglyphic texts. From clothes and water to ointments, eye paint, and an incredible array of food, the damaged list of offerings in Inti's burial apartments held everything a court member would have needed to sustain him. Inti's burial apartments' offerings were extensive and meticulously differentiated, featuring both domestic and wild birds, various raw and cooked meat cuts, and quantities of onions that, according to modern vendors in the same region, would have been as sweet as honey. In the pyramid texts, various versions of this hamper with wine and fruit appear from its first appearance in King Weny's burial chamber to the end of the Old Kingdom. Therefore, they offered the same offerings to the living and the dead. There are fragmentary versions of these offering lists inscribed on the walls of Abusir's royal temples, and, later on, those of South Saqqara, where they appear as lists of offerings made to the living king. Temples often depict officiating priests holding papyrus rolls with these lists. These huge lists seem to be copied from scrolls, just like the letters in the courtiers' tombs. Many verses in the pyramid texts, including those of their offering lists, start with and end with phrases like recitation and end of the section. This shows that the written scrolls did not contain letters or biographies, but verses that the priests read aloud during the offering ceremonies. Similarly, the calligraphic texts of the papyrus rolls had already become formalized in their monumental hieroglyphic versions decades before they first appeared in King Weny's pyramid. The calligraphic texts of the papyrus rolls had already been formalized in their monumental hieroglyphic versions decades before they first appeared in King Weny's pyramid. For instance, Weny's predecessor King Isisi inscribed letters in Inti's tomb chapel around the doorway in long vertical columns, mirroring the texts carved into the later pyramids. Similarly, the tomb chapels of Debeny, Raweh and Rashepses also arranged their memoirs vertically. Priests conducted a ceremony in courtly households and tomb chapels before mealtimes, during which they presented offerings. A rhythmic chest beat accompanies priestly incantations in this relief from the tomb chapel of the Courtier, Kargemni at Saqqara. So when Weny's came to power, the sudden majestic appearance of hundreds upon hundreds of columned texts inside his pyramid had a modest but practical precedent, one that also had a reasonable explanation in typical pharaonic fashion. Indeed, Weny's pyramid, the smallest of the Old Kingdom's royal pyramids, stood in the heart of a densely packed cemetery. The pavement slabs of the pyramid temple overlaid the underground apartments of an archaic king's tomb. Upon completion of the pyramid and its adjacent temple, the cramped environment left little room for architectural additions. With its ongoing offerings and manufacturing processes, the court machine had ample opportunity to elaborate and enlarge its original conception of such royal monuments during Weny's long reign, as was often the case during other lengthy rules. From Weny's pyramid, a nearly half-mile-long road ran through the cemeteries to the desert's edge, passing some ancient quarries and covering many earlier tombs buried until their excavation in the 1960s. Its walls once contained a remarkable series of reliefs with an innovative range of subject matter. One unique scene survived the lime burners. The late addition to Weny's other monuments depicts celebrations following the placement of the capstone on the royal pyramid. Similar to those beside the Great Pyramid of Giza, where the disassembled planks of King Khufu's boats were stored at the royal funeral. Two narrow pits were also cut into the rock by the sides of the causeway's embankments. An equally grand temple adorned the end of this tremendously long causeway, its architecture continually elaborated until it reached a final form as magnificent as any at Abusir. The Valley Temple is likely near Weny's palace and its associated settlements, close to an ancient canal and the desert's edge. As a result, The royal funerary arrangements architecture matured over decades in somewhat straitened circumstances. To modern eyes, the texts cut into Venice's pyramids' walls are the greatest elaborations in Bati? Where are you? The god Bati is in the water with the fish. The catfish and the oxyrhynchus fish converse with him, but where is Bati? Bati is passionate about the West. The Song of a Shepherd was written around 2440 BC, a tomb chapel in T's tomb. Taking Pepi with you is your duty, father of Pepi. Happy Mother's Day, Nut. It is time for Pepi to enter the gates of the sky. Open the gates to Pepi's cool waters. To make Pepi live, he comes to you. You told this Pepi to sit beside you on the dawn-rising one's shoulder. Adapted from Pyramid Text 573. Since the Pyramid texts are written in the present tense and have an authoritative voice, they are generally considered rhetorical writings. It was not an innovation in itself. Many of the scenes on tomb chapels and temple walls had already been engraved with commands, exclamations, and even the words of little songs long before their first appearance in the Pyramid of Venice. Most of the Pyramid text's 900 verses are not longer than a few hundred words, and most are shorter. None of them, however, provide any explanation, doctrine, or dogma. Between them, there is no continuous narrative. In the modern world, these writers may appear deliberately obtuse, mysterious, or even mystical because of their apparent lack of purpose and often impenetrable prose. Despite this, their contemporary context could be more surprising, as the written texts of the ancient Lower Nile never encompassed the core of its culture. The society had already built colossal pyramids and temples centuries before the texts appeared, and its courtiers and scribes had managed those vast enterprises without any written explanation. Its construction and movement embodied pharaonic Egypt's most profound and characteristic expressions. On the other hand, the unexpected discovery of texts within the pyramids offered insights into the modern Western world, a culture deeply rooted in the written word. These texts offered a written explanation of the beliefs behind the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, and the promise of a literary pedigree for a culture whose roots date back to prehistory. Abruptly rediscovered in the 1880s, the pyramid texts became one of Egyptology's most significant ongoing projects. Contemporary European conditions, such as those of Champollion and his successors, influenced this second phase of deciphering Egyptian history. Furthermore, providing a deeper understanding of Old Egyptian grammar has enhanced the performance and translation of ancient texts. Pyramid texts were discovered in 1880 AD. During excavations to fill its cases, a new museum in Cairo, called the Cannibal Museum of Antiquities, discovered the first pyramid texts in modern times. By 1880, Mariette Pasha, the museum's founder, designer, and director, had excavated sites up and down the Lower Nile, leading to the discovery of the first of those texts. Peasant farmers worked in corvée to free the country's most extraordinary tombs and temples from the sands and buildings encrusted with sand and debris. Those were the glory years for restoring pharaonic culture, but not for those hapless farmers. Through these labors, Mariette had recovered many of ancient Egypt's most treasured relics, which he wanted to display in a new museum in order of pharaonic history by 1880. There was a shortage of cash, however. During the decades of Mariette's excavations, Egypt's ruler, Khedive Ismail, accumulated enormous debts to European banks, resulting in famines in the countryside, the sale of the Suez Canal to the British government, and the establishment of an English and French European ministry in Cairo. During the first months of 1880, Mariette planned to fill in some historical gaps in his collection by undertaking further excavations. But he was forced to focus his holes on just 2 locations. Mariette employed 40 laborers to work alongside the temples at the Giza Sphinx. His work gangs sent just 20 men and boys to dig in the gentle hills of South Saqqara, a site they had briefly touched in earlier years, but whose stone-studded sands promised more treasures. In late February 1880, Mariette visited the South Saqqara excavations under race headman Ruby Hamzawi, with whom he had worked side by side since his first days in Egypt. There had been a large hill of sand and loose stone blocks, and at the centre the work gangs had uncovered slabs of white limestone with columns of blue-painted hieroglyphs containing Pepi II cartouches. Mariette knew the rarity of lengthy inscriptions from the Old Kingdom and had squeezed those stones. During this process, Mariette pressed sheets of heavy handmade paper soaked in water against an engraved stone and stippled it with a brush. Once dried, the stiffened card would contain a negative copy of the original, often decorated with traces of ancient pigments. As Cairo warmed up to its torrid summer that year, Mariette, a long-time diabetes patient in increasingly poor health, sailed for France. While visiting Paris, he presented his South Saqqara squeezes to Gaston Maspero, a former protégé who had become a brilliant young professor of Egyptian philology at the Collège de France, and the author of a significant history of the ancient Orient. Later, Maspero said he understood that Mariette's squeezes had come from the burial chamber of a royal pyramid. As an alternative, Mariette believed they were from the chapel of a courtier's tomb, as he had found many kings' cartouches engraved in tomb chapels, but not a single hieroglyph on the walls of royal pyramids. His health did not improve after he met Maspero in Paris, and he became increasingly depressed. The Egyptian government also imposed an international committee of liquidation comprising 4 European bureaucrats to control the nation's finances and repay the national debt to foreign banks. Within a month, the committee's British representative, Captain Evelyn Baring, a member of a prominent German banking family, proposed a savage list of reforms: further cuts to education, the army, and the civil service, and a refusal to relax the tax levels that had caused famine and unrest. In October, after visiting Boulogne-sur-Mer, Mariette returned to Egypt, feeling he was dying. He invited his old friend, the German Egyptologist Heinrich Brugsch, who had worked with Mariette since the beginning of his excavations, to return to Egypt. After a month-long voyage, Mariette arrived in Alexandria hemorrhaging profusely. In Cairo, Emil Brugsch, Heinrich's brother and a curator at the new museum, set up a couch on the open porch for Mariette as soon as he arrived. When word reached Paris, Mariette was mortally ill. After Napoleon's grand tour of the East, who would assume France's central role in Egyptian cultural affairs? If Mariette dies, what will happen to the Bulaq Museum? We would be unable to take action, and could not anticipate any outcome. We should act quickly, as the event may be imminent. We should not allow Turin to gain more wealth at our expense. As a good patriot and Frenchman, a great honor would be yours if you could do so. This epistolary letter was addressed to Arthur Rohn, a friend of Maspero's and a French government official. It had long been discussed that such a situation might arise. Baron de Ring, the French consul general in Egypt, has already suggested that the European powers formalize the role Mariette carved out for himself within the administration of Egypt's antiquities, an organization that collects and protects antiquities, and establish a French institute in Cairo, following the model Baron Bunsen had established for the Prussian Institutes of Archaeology in Rome and Athens. Maspero promptly met the challenge. On November 13th, 1880, Baron de Ring appointed Maspero head of a mission of French archaeologists to Egypt and asked him to establish an Institute of Oriental Archaeology in Cairo. During Maspero's packing for Cairo, a French government decree ratified the Baron's proposals and approved funds. During this time, Brugsch Bey left Göttingen University's Egyptology chair and arrived in Cairo before his dying friend. As they sat on the museum's wooden porch, Mariette asked him to inspect the South Saqqara excavations, where Reis Ruby had found 2 more texts similar to those from which Mariette had made the squeezes. In the past, Reis Ruby had told Mariette that all those texts lay at the center of destroyed pyramids. Riding donkeys up into the sandhills of South Saqqara, Brugsch Bey and his brother discovered that Giza teams had augmented Mariette's workforce. Upon finding the ruins, the brothers discovered no fewer than 3 royal pyramids, which had been so denuded by stone robbers that their interiors lay exposed and open to the sky, as Reis Ruby had described. According to Brugsch, these chambers belonged to Pepi I, Pepi II, and Merenre, the intermediary ruler. Due to the excavation of the sand and rubble filling, some of the massive blocks of the burial chamber's broken roofs hung unsupported, endangering the texts. The danger of sudden burial in soft-flowing sand was also ever present in desert excavations. Despite everything, there are writings in the pyramids. I would never believe it. After hearing Brugsch's report that evening, Mariette famously said, "Even so, I would not have believed there were writings in the pyramids." The following day, the brothers returned to South Saqqara and scrambled through the ruined pyramids to check the copies of the texts they had made the day before. The mummy of a young man, eviscerated, embalmed, and wrapped in fine linen, lay in Merenre's ruined burial chamber. His skin was well preserved, his features distinct, his eyes closed, and his nose had fallen in. He might have been the king, but his burial was likely intrusive. At last, the brothers immediately took this strange package to Mariette's bedside to see the face of Pharaoh. As they carried the brittle cadaver down from the pyramids to the railway station, Charles Wilbur, an American student of Professor Maspero, met them. Wilbur describes the brothers Brugsch as covered in dust, their trousers ripped, their knees bloodied, with one at the mummy's head and the other at the mummy's feet, on their way to view Mariette's South Saqqara excavations. Brugsch Bey recalls the dusty offering breaking later in its journey to Cairo. Mariette, he says, wasn't delighted with it. He had a coherent conversation with his friend for the last time. The Egyptian parliament received the joint note 6 days after Mariette's burial. At the museum, he had gathered his assistants. In Victor Loret's diary, Maspero's accompanying student describes the scene at Boulak, then a suburb of Cairo, along the Nile but now part of the city centre. The funeral procession had a scheduled time of 3 p.m. A grille separated Mariette's garden and the museum, while armchairs and chairs in the Egyptian style scattered the yard. The museum's main hall showcased a sycamore coffin sealed with red wax. Soldiers, red fezzes, and Franciscans were among the mourners, accompanied by pharaohs and Egyptian sphinxes, old Memphite and Roman tombs, and the impassive Khafra and the hawk, beneath which, it seemed, Mariette's grave would lie. Ultimately, he planted Mariette in the gardens of the Cairo Museum, the first national museum of antiquities outside of Europe, in a granite sarcophagus of pharaonic style. When Wolff began his investigations, he had analysed the language of 2 of the venerable texts of Greek literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey, a study that led him to the revolutionary conclusion that these 2 works were not the work of a single poet, but compilations of several different writers. Until then, scholars regarded these texts as the primary source of ancient history. Nevertheless, Wolff's groundbreaking philological analysis showed that classical literature could reveal a previously unknown history, an intellectual history, and an entirely new dimension. However, schools of specially trained philologists must thoroughly analyze all classical literature. That led Wolff to reinvent the seminar, a medieval form of study in which students gathered under a professor's guidance to conduct original research. German universities developed linguistics and textual criticism during the 19th century. Classical and biblical scholarship took on entirely new paths. This process significantly impacted academia and disrupted the European churches. This revolution in learning also led to Göttingen becoming a centre for biblical, Sanskrit and classical literature. By the 1870s, the universities of Leipzig, Berlin and Paris were establishing chairs of Egyptology, and the academic discipline of studying the ancient Egyptian language was gaining prominence. At the same time, a re-evaluation of the role of original documents, rather than the continuous reuse of old historical commentaries, was also underway, prompted by the growth of the study of philology. As a result of the increasing use of the seminar as a learning tool, new disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, ethnography, linguistics, and art history emerged. Simultaneously developing these new disciplines and establishing physical sciences within European universities encouraged a typical academic investigative language. As a result, there were new tools and methods for studying history, and Wolff first called his philological research the science of history. This became a project that many university departments worked on together, and Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Mellendorf later called it the conquest of the past by scholarship. After Göttingen, Berlin's university, now the Humboldt University of Berlin, played a significant role in partitioning new areas of study into different academic disciplines. In the first decade of the 19th century, Alexander von Humboldt established Berlin's university as the pinnacle of his visionary notion of an education system for the entire Prussian population, based on merit and designed to instill the values of the autocratic state. Berlin's university, amidst the wide, well-ordered avenues of a city Mark Twain had compared to Chicago in the 1890s, received direct state funding. A state commission funded projects such as Ehrman's Dictionary. In addition, many of its professors were influential parliamentary and courtly figures. They all possessed a similar work ethic, a strong sense of a fundamental order in civilized societies, a strong belief in science, history and philology, and a solid loyalty to their academic disciplines and universities. In summary, this literary culture, known as Kultur Protestantismus even in its time, was unique in its hierarchies and learning methods, cultivating a monk-like dedication to study. She had invited Brugsch Bey to Cairo specifically to succeed him as director of Egyptian antiquities. While Egypt had changed dramatically since he and his friend first excavated at Saqqara, the Baron de Ring had moved quickly among the international committees and the ministers of the Khedival government to ensure Maspero would take over Egypt's antiquities. At Mariette's funeral, Brugsch walked behind the coffin alone, separated from all the other foreigners. A few days later, French government funds were used for the excavations at South Saqqara. Mariette's papers and library were purchased for France, and his two beloved daughters, who had been left penniless in Cairo, were given passage back to Paris. The speed of those arrangements led to an incorrect shipment of Mariette's antiquities inventory to France for the new Cannibal Museum. At that time, Arabi's regiments marched on Cairo and sacked some government ministries and law courts. The Khedive's protests prompted Captain Baring, the British commissioner, to recall Baron de Ring, who had participated in Arabi's rebellious officers, to France, where he later became the minister of the Ottoman court in Constantinople. Refinanced by funds from France and Cook's tours, the Saqqara excavations expanded to encompass the ruins of the pyramids in central Saqqara. On February 28, 1881, they opened the interior of Wenis's pyramid, revealing a nearly perfect set of pyramid texts for the first time in modern times. Within a month, researchers entered the nearby pyramid of Wenis's successor, Sethi, and discovered similar texts on its walls. At the same time, Mariette's old king was opening Sethi's ruined pyramid, Maspero, with his wife and staff, and several French government agents took an inspection tour down the Nile in Mariette's old steamboat, the Menchier. On that triumphant voyage, one of his prime objectives was to discover a tomb or tombs that had supplied the museums of the West with fine papyri and other delicate funerary objects for a decade. 2 years ago, the police arrested 3 brothers of a prominent local family, the Abd er-Rasul, who after months of threat and torture revealed the location of a cache of mummies, including those of many famous Egyptian pharaohs. At that time, Massou had already returned to France, so it fell to Émile Brugsch and Ahmed Kamal Bey, one of the few trained Egyptian Egyptologists of the day, working as a secretary at the new museum, to empty that most remarkable of funerary crypts. The European press hailed Professor Maspero and his new administration for their outstanding discoveries, the pyramid texts and the royal mummies. In 1909, the affable Parisian professor, with the assistance of Egypt's British rulers, controlled Egypt's antiquities. Maspero oversaw the government's operations from the museum, publishing and presenting the national collections in a new museum. As director of the Service des Antiquités, Maspero also supervised the distribution of excavators' fines to the National Museum and granted permits for all excavations within Egypt. Maspero and successive French scholars held the directorate until the Egyptian Revolution in 1956. The requirements, demands, and attitudes of contemporary European academics and international museums, along with foreign nationalism and high finance, guided ancient Egypt's excavations and interpretations for approximately 70 years, influencing ancient Egyptian history even today. From Saqqara to Berlin, stone to paper. Maspero was on his first Nile cruise in the Menchie when a young Englishman walked for hours across the desert to the excavations at South Saqqara. At Dr. Birch's request, he climbed down through the broken roof of Pepi Wern's burial chamber and copied some of the texts Brugsch Bey and his brother had copied a week earlier. As a result, an anonymous correspondent reporting in the April edition of the Athenaeum magazine released the first public news of the discovery of the pyramid texts, thanks to William Matthew Flinders Petrie, the most gifted of contemporary archaeologists. Later, Birch and Brugsch Bey published an article containing transcriptions and translations of those same texts in the Proceedings of the Society for Biblical Archaeology, a leading Egyptology journal to which Maspero had contributed many articles. Although its authors readily acknowledged that these texts were full of difficulties, they could hold new chapters of human history and religious revelation, establish a connection between the world's most ancient sacred writings and those of the Old Testament. The two British articles vexed the French establishment. While trifling and inaccurate, their appearance stole the public's attention from the world's most ancient religious writings, leaving Maspero to publish sections of the 4,000 pyramid texts. Over the next decade, until 1894, he published an authoritative volume of the texts. Previously, precedence of publication had been a matter of courtesy between interested gentlemen. Now, such issues have become political and professional. The first glimpse of the pyramid texts came from Petrie and Heinrich Brugsch's handwritten copy of part of their contents. A prolific and lively writer since his youth, Maspero's 1875 History of the Ancient Orient, which became a standard text for historians and Bible scholars alike, brought him to the attention of the Baron of Ring. He was already a luminary of the Collège de France when he joined that celebrated Parisian circle of linguistic scholarship, which had already attracted Champollion, Bunsen, Lepsius, and many others. Thus, after a 6-year stint in Cairo, he returned to Paris and the Collège de France, leaving his various Egyptian projects in the hands of his students. It was there, in 1895, that he first met Alan Gardiner, a precocious 16-year-old who had just been awarded a scholarship to attend the Collège de France at the request of his father, a silk merchant and city banker. As Gardiner later recalled, "Even as a boy nearing the end of his schooling, I was fired with the desire to become an Egyptologist." After suffering through the elaborate French of one of Maspero's lectures in Paris, Gardiner asked him precisely what the meaning of a single verse contained within the pyramids was. "My imagination is endless, you know. According to Maspero, I gave you an excellent explanation, but I am certain I could have given you 20 equally good explanations." In later years, Sir Alan Gardiner, arguably the most excellent Egyptologist England has ever produced, reached a similar conclusion regarding ancient Egyptian religious texts. No factual background can demonstrate the appropriateness of this or that rendering. This must present extraordinary difficulties when dealing with texts of a purely moralizing character, as no factual background demonstrates the appropriateness of this or that rendering. Attending Maspero's lectures seemed unwarranted to young Gardner, who would always strive for clarity and had already become convinced that Maspero was an unsound grammarian. Since their discovery, the pyramid texts have presented Egyptologists with particular difficulties in understanding them, because they are the most ambiguous and archaic Egyptian literature. Maspero lectured in Paris when a group of philologists working in Berlin, part of a century-old school of research whose mission was to conquer the ancient world through scholarship, revolutionized the study of ancient Egypt, its hieroglyphs, and its religion. In 1902, Gardner, a year after graduating from Oxford University, travelled to Berlin and spent 12 years studying there, buying a house, building a library, and starting a family while contributing to the creation of a great, grand hieroglyphic dictionary that would include all words from all known hieroglyphic texts. Because of that work, Gardner met Professor Adolf Erman, founder of the Berlin School of Egyptology and Hieroglyphic Dictionary. In the same generation as Maspero, Erman was the son and grandson of eminent Berlin academics, descendants of a circle of humanists and intellectuals who founded the University of Berlin at the turn of the 18th century, and made it the world's most influential learning center. Studies and research conducted at that university have had a greater influence on modern views of ancient Egypt than the works of Jean-François Champollion. George II of England, the Duke of Brunswick, and the Prince Elector of Hanover established a university south of Berlin, where Friedrich August Wolff matriculated in 1777 as a studiosus philologies, a student of philology, a department that did not exist in the Western world at the time. Of course, studying ancient written records and exotic literature was nothing new. After the Renaissance, Europe's courts and monasteries used that study to better interpret both the Bible and the law. Wolff was Winckelmann's biographer, and like most educated Europeans of his time, he was also a disciple of his view of ancient Greek culture as the epitome of human society. As a result, Wolff employed philology's traditional tools at Göttingen, one of the most liberal 18th century universities, not to better understand the Church's writings, but to recover something of the lost reality of pagan ancient Greece. Dictionaries and grammars. Adolf Erman was born in 1854 and only played a small role in Germany's remarkable academic machine, transforming modern perceptions of ancient Egypt. The rapid philological developments in studying other ancient languages greatly benefited Erman, who had been born into that high literary culture. Erman, however, found that at the beginning of his career, his peers regarded his chosen subject as needing more academic rigor, and its translations of ancient texts as somewhat fanciful. The relative isolation of ancient Egyptians from other ancient languages had been an asset for him, as he developed a methodology based entirely on pharaonic texts and classical philological syntax. Everything changed when Erman came along. Using the methodologies of classical philology and linguistics, he analyzed the grammar of hieroglyphic texts in his 20s and began to publish a brilliant stream of technical articles on the subject while still in his 20s. From the beginning of his work, Erman employed a single essential perception to transform contemporary Western views of ancient Egypt. To gain a deeper understanding of the hieroglyphic language, which had been used for millennia, and whose ultimate expression was written in Coptic Greek, it was necessary to isolate, compare, and describe its various phases as they developed over time. As other academics have long since done with different languages, Erman broke the language's history into successive phases. Erman's bipartite linguistic division is equivalent to Bunsen's tripartition of pharaonic history. Erman's Old Egyptian is the written language of Bunsen's Old and Middle Kingdoms, while Erman's Later Egyptian appears during the New Kingdom. In 1880, a neat, bespectacled 26-year-old young man published his Neuägyptische Grammatik. A decade later, he demonstrated his prodigious knowledge of developing ancient and modern languages. A study of ancient scribes' calligraphy enabled Erman to produce Die Sprache de Papyrus Westcar, a grammatical analysis of fairy stories about Hajadef, the magician Jedi, and the priest's wife who gave birth to kings. Lepsius's papers contained a unique, unrolled, unpublished document because its translation had eluded all previous scholars. Several years later, Erman published a more comprehensive grammar, Ägyptische Grammatik, in which he used examples of texts from various periods of pharaonic history to demonstrate how the written language had developed over time. A decade after Bruggsch's first failed attempts to copy and decipher the pyramid texts, he used them as a primary source for Old Egyptian. Erman's method of transcribing hieroglyphs into the Latin alphabet was so innovative that his American translator had to invent English equivalents for some of Erman's technical terms, derived from contemporary Semitic studies. Erman's studies rendered all earlier grammar obsolete. He laid the foundations of modern Egyptology almost single-handedly, and Berlin became the global center for his research. While working on his Ägyptische Grammatik, Erman contacted Maspero to request a fresh copy of a passage from the pyramid texts, the impressions of which were on Mariette's paper squeezes. Upon receiving the corrected text, Erman reportedly commented, "What a pity the Egyptians couldn't write correctly even at this early period." I'm sorry to hear that. Upon hearing Erman's comments, Maspero remarked that the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom hadn't read the grammar of Erman. Egyptology was considered science in Berlin, and was the subject of generations of researchers who would develop it stage by stage into a tremendous text-based source of knowledge that represented the ancient civilization in logical and documented detail. Gardiner later observed that the Berlin School's methods, not arrogance, trained many Egyptologists of the day, particularly those from French and British universities and museums. Berliners ignored the work of others except those of their own persuasion, mainly due to the Berlin School's rigorous methods, which had taken the place of earlier interpreters' personal intuitions, often haphazard. In 1897, the primary activity of this endeavor was the compilation of Erman's hieroglyphic dictionary, which entailed copying, translating, and listing the words and phrases on Egypt's standing monuments, and the museums throughout the world. Although it was a precise and time-consuming undertaking, a willing and experienced crew was available to help. Gardiner, like Egyptologists, traveled to Berlin, Europe and America to study Erman's grammar books. They worked on compiling the Wörterbuch, as the Berlin Hieroglyphic Dictionary has become affectionately known, as they explored the newly created science of Egyptology with its inventor. German and Austrian scholars copied ancient Egyptian texts and those from Great Britain. American student James Henry Breasted, who translated Erman's Ägyptische Grammatik in the year of its German publication, copied texts from museums across Europe. The Wörterbuch hired Gardiner a few years later. Kurt Sethi, one of Erman's closest academic colleagues and a former student, also worked on the pyramid texts. During his lifetime, he spent much time in the museums of Leiden and Turin, where he transcribed many of the papyri Champollion had unrolled nearly a century earlier, converting their calligraphic texts into neat lines of hieroglyphs. Following Erman's translation of Papyrus Westcar, Gardiner's work on those papyri broadened the dictionary's scope to include many ancient handwritten documents, instead of only monumental inscriptions on wood and stone. Erman and other senior editors scrutinized the enormous lexicographical enterprise, producing 1,200,000 individual slips of paper, each containing approximately 30 words in hieroglyphic blocks. Erman and other senior editors cross-referenced every word on every slip into extensive catalogues, allowing for the indexing and listing of every known occurrence. This was the basis for the Berlin Dictionary, which, like the Oxford English Dictionary, defines each word by quotation to trace its evolution and changes over 3 millennia. It has been in various forms since the early 1920s. But with the results of that research already appearing in the works of many scholars before the First World War, it was and remains a remarkable achievement. While simultaneously using philology's principal virtue of scientific accuracy, it quietly incorporated into the modern vision of ancient Egypt the attitudes and opinions of the Berlin School, especially those of Professor Ehrman and the German academics of his day. As expected, these were products of their time and place. Winckelmann's and Humboldt's earlier concepts, allied to political currents of late 19th century Germany, all beautifully encapsulated by Ehrman in his Life in Ancient Egypt. Preface in 1886. When we compare Greece's youthful, joyous art to Egypt's severe, sober art, we must remember that the latter grew on the low soil of the Nile Valley, the land of hard work. According to factual logic, an autocratic government can only control and regulate irrigation. The earliest knowledge of Egypt's living conditions strictly regulated political and agrarian relations, disregarding individual considerations. They developed languages, religions, and governments similar to those of later nations. The laws that governed them are still in force. Ancient kingdoms were founded through wars similar to those in modern times. A history of ancients and moderns. Despite Gardner's dislike of the Berlin School's exclusivity, its views and work ethic resonated strongly with the hard-working young American James Henry Breasted, who came from a similar background of Midwestern Congregationalism. The University of Berlin, the high temple of that order of learning, emanated a special aura from the young man's strict principles, and that America had primarily modelled its public education system after Prussia's. It led to Professor Ehrman's seminar. Breasted transcribed numerous hieroglyphic inscriptions for the Wörterbuch during his time in Berlin. A decade later, with the help of additional fieldwork in Egypt and European museums, he produced Ancient Records of Egypt, a remarkable 5-volume epic of translation covering 2,500 years of Egyptian texts that became the standard English translation of most ancient Egyptian historical texts for most of the 20th century. Following his appointment as the first professor of Egyptology in the United States, Breasted mined those same texts for his 1906 book, A History of Egypt. In addition to his ancient records, this also served as a definitive general history of ancient Egypt. Most current accounts follow Breasted's impressive narratives in their lively and authoritative prose, and preoccupation with politics and economics, judgments, and characterizations. A decade after the Berlin seminar, Breasted published the first and most influential of his 2 works on the development of ancient Egyptian religion. We dedicate this book to Professor Ehrman, who pioneered the presentation of Egyptian religion from a historical perspective, according to one of Ehrman's esteemed contemporaries. In addition to his historical works on ancient Egypt, scholars hailed Breasted's first volume on ancient Egyptian religion as a classic. In addition, they all recount ancient Egypt's history as a narrative of ethical and material progress. For instance, Breasted narrates a millennial journey from savagery through barbarism to decadence and dissolution in his second volume on religion. For Breasted and Northern Europeans like Ehrman, this journey represented a progression from paganism to high church decadence, a path that, without the intervention of Protestant Christianity, is destined to end. More than any other individual, Breasted's writings have transmitted Berlin's attitudes toward ancient Egyptian history and culture to English speakers. Just as Ehrman's earlier popular books introduced ancient Egypt to generations of German speakers. During Berlin's poverty-stricken decades after the First World War, Breasted's pious Maecenas, John D. Rockefeller, generously acknowledged Ehrman's Wörterbuch's connection. Gardner's Egyptian grammar, which first appeared in 1927, also became the crib of successive generations of Egyptological students worldwide, echoing Ehrman's earlier grammar even in its typographic layout. My desire to become an Egyptologist drove me to use classical grammar, Gardner's grammar, to study hieroglyphic writing, just as Ehrman had done. Almost as much as I was interested in the things to discover, I was equally interested in the methods and course of discovery. It offers students the old epigraphic promise of conquering the past through scholarship, as it is affectionately known. More than a century ago, Friedrich August Wolff established his teachings at Göttingen, while Ehrmann and Sethi taught in Berlin. In his 1961 biographical essay, Gardiner affirmed that the traditional classical philology methodology could reveal the past and progress of ancient history. The pyramid texts. The king offers an offering. Anubis gives the offering. From the highlands come to thee your 1,000 young antelope with bowed heads. What a gift! Anubis gives this offering. Thank you for your 1,000 loaves. Thank you for your 1,000 beers. From the palace hall you sent forth 1,000 incenses. Your 1,000 incense held everything pleasant. There are 1,000 cattle in your herd. Everything you eat in 1,000, on which your desire is set. In addition to his work on the Berlin Dictionary, Sethi's most significant contribution to Egyptology was an edition of copied hieroglyphs, translations, and commentaries of all texts engraved in pyramids at the time. Sethi's edition has been the foundation of virtually every discussion of the readers of the pyramids. He is, in fact, the one who first named those texts, collectively, Pyramiden Texten, pyramid texts. In Maspero's Les Inscriptions des Pyramides de Saqqara, he translated each verse's meaning based on his understanding of the funerary texts of later ages, as no other comparable texts were available. Due to their mysterious nature, Maspero's work was quite subtle, but he readily acknowledged it was primarily based on intuition, derived from extensive studies of ancient Egypt and its religion. Maspero turned the long-column texts of engraved hieroglyphs into letterpress hieroglyphics. He removed the ancient original's vertical columns, which Seth had used. Instead, they are set up in horizontal lines from left to right, like in Western writing. Also, ancient texts don't say how they were meant to be read. For example, Maspero and Sethi started their editions of the pyramid's old verses, with the list of offerings written on the north wall of the burial chambers, then worked their way outwards towards the entrances of the pyramids, arranging the texts in a way that made sense given how they were placed in each corridor and room. Sethi also based his edition of Weny's pyramid on the texts in Maspero's edition. These examples were, and still are, the oldest and best preserved. The interior of the pyramid was covered, but only partially preserved. They are the primary versions of the longer sets of texts found in later pyramids, the Editio Princeps. However, the similarities between the two versions ended when Seth based his analysis and explanation on 19th century German classical and biblical scholarship. Neatly highlights his borrowings by adopting the term Sprüche, proverbs, referring to the various verses in the texts by different names. In addition, Seth arranged the verses in numerical order, following the order of his presentation, from burial chamber to doorway, a system devised initially by another of the seminar's Egyptologists, Count Hans Schackenberg, and still widely used today. In the same way, the main goal of Göttingen's classical seminars was to examine different, often damaged versions of the same text, to determine when it was written. Sethi ordered different versions of the verses from all the known pyramids within his numerical sequence, adding new poems as they were found under the latest numbers at the end of his list. This is still being done today, as hundreds of new verses and variations of well-known older ones have been found. In Weny's pyramid, Maspero presents and numbers the various verses in the order they appear to visitors. Sethi presents Maspero's verse number 1 in 5 different versions. Here are a few passages from Maspero's and Sethi's editions of the pyramid texts. As a result of Sethi's study of the pyramid texts, combined with the leap in understanding of ancient language experienced in the Berlin seminars, his copies, translations, and commentary reached a level of coherence unheard of before. Due to the extraordinary nature of this achievement, Only in 1968 was a single pyramid's text, that of Venice, published and translated separately as a separate work. Despite that, the transference of the dark columns of engraving from the walls of pyramids to the ordered processes of a European seminar profoundly influenced their modern understanding. Through Sethi's Pyramiden Texten, the ancient verses were indexed, cross-referenced, analyzed, ranked, and categorized like never before, allowing the modern world to read them as if they were book chapters. There was an effect in that the numbered verses encouraged a search for connecting narratives. Pyramid texts were also used as an esoteric encyclopedia, from which many indices and strange lines could be extracted as if from a pudding to explain everything, ancient Egyptian, from grasshoppers' sacredness to coloured stones found in temples. The pyramid texts were, therefore, considered full of metaphors and symbols when analysed according to classical and Bible scholarship methods. While accurate metaphors or symbols are ambivalent and change meaning with their purposes, analogies are not. The pyramid texts represented simple beliefs through ciphers. Breasted's commentaries say that some passages could help us understand how Western morals and ethics came to be. Other passages could be myths that explain how the universe came to be and how it works. And still other passages could be a description of the rituals that are done at royal funerals, like the Book of Common Prayer. Having gained considerable academic pedigree and a language of their own, such approaches have a long literary history. Communication is on time. Professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, Friedrich Nietzsche, recognized the danger of studying ancient texts in the manner employed by Ehrman and Breasted decades before their work. Like many other Europeans of his time, Nietzsche saw classical antiquity as an age of profound accomplishment derived from the work of Winckelmann and Goethe. In the 1870s, after he resigned as professor of German history following a bitter controversy, Nietzsche's dazzling blast of insult and insight, known as We Philologists, stands as an impassioned and passionate salute to 19th-century German academia. Despite this, Nietzsche's conception of classical Greece differed from those of his contemporaries, who thought that the social harmony and the artistic achievements of Winckelmann's ancient Greece could be reenacted through a strong government and classical education, and that industrial Europe, and especially Germany, would be able to regain those levels of perfection. According to Nietzsche, classical Greek urban culture was the antithesis of contemporary European society. The better the organization of the state, Nietzsche declared with an eye toward the city of Berlin, the newly founded capital of the German Empire, the duller humanity will be. Thus, the professors of philology, the gatekeepers of antiquity, were guilty of providing false visions of the classical past, providing modern humanity with dangerous aspirations. Nietzsche saw classical antiquity as a fiercely free thing that could never be absorbed by other people in his former profession, who were more interested in studying an academic life than in the realities of the past. According to Nietzsche, these people tempered their view of ancient history with shallow rationalism and a timid submission typical of professionals paid by the government. Despite historical changes in Nietzsche's arguments, the fundamental questions posed by his diatribe remain valid. How should we view history? Is philology an excellent science to understand? Can record and philology even be considered sciences? Can we better understand the ancient past if we divide ancient societies into epigraphic, economic, cultural, religious, and political components of the 19th century? Would such approaches explain why those lines of cattle waiting patiently to be slaughtered at Abu Sir had been gathered amidst the dust? Are the giant shadowed animals standing amid clouds of incense and the stench of blood and dung not acts of offering and provision? Can they link them to the making of flint knives for slaughter, the construction of temples and fine statues, the structure of barges and pyramids, and the evidence that the pharaoh was the bull of his mother? In particular, Nietzsche was critical of the method many of his contemporaries used to define and isolate certain aspects of ancient societies as religious in the Christian sense of the term, an approach Champollion and the Berlin School advocated. Nietzsche remarked that any view like this assumes that a sense of the divine and a need to worship have been constant throughout human history, without any basis for proof. Instead, he asked, what if people began to worship? In antiquity, there were no priests of religion, priest guild, or holy writ. There were only priests of individual gods. The hellhounds, triple and primitivism, the bones of the Berlin seminars. Primitive and the hellhounds triple, the bones of the Berlin seminars. As clouds darken the sky, the stars fall. He feeds on his mothers. Grasper of Forelocks lives in Kehu, lord of messengers, who sends his messages. King Wenis eats men and lives on gods. They are on their way to King Wenis. The punisher of all evil-doers stabs them for King Wenis. He takes out the entrails. King Wenis has Shesmu cut them up and cook a portion of them for him in his evening kettles. Wenis is the king who consumes their charms and devours their glory. His morning portion includes the wonderful ones. His evening portion is for his middle ones, while his night portion is for his little ones. They burn incense. They are the great ones north of the sky. With the legs of their oldest ones as fuel, he set fire to the kettles containing them. King Wenis has risen again to the skies as the king of the horizon. Breasted translated the pyramid texts numbers 393 to 414 in 1915, apocryphally known as the Cannibal Hymn in the early 20th century. The pyramid texts that Sethi numbered 393 to 414 contain several different descriptions of the events following the death and resurrection of a pharaoh. The verses describe the king's journey to join the unseen population of the unseen world, which in this case is presented as the night sky of the Lower Nile, and conclude with Pharaoh's establishment as a star, shining as a lord of the horizon, alongside the other gods. The Cannibal Hymn is unique among known pyramid texts in that the progress of this cosmic transfiguration is described through the slaughtering, cooking, and eating of several gods. Ancient scribes didn't greatly favor it either, since it only reappeared once in the pyramid of Teti's successor, after its inscription inside Wenis's pyramid. Its extreme violence was interpreted by Breasted as a picture of grotesque cannibalism. The gods are hunted, lassoed, bound, and slaughtered like wild cattle. He explained its presence among the other texts that describe the same migration in more prayerful or liturgical tones as originating from a much more distant time, when the savage pharaoh ferociously hunted the gods like bloodthirsty. In contrast, modern explanations of the Cannibal Hymn suggest its violent imagery is based on the account of the slaughter, butchery, cooking and eating of a sacrificial bull. Its reference to Wenis as the bull of the sky, a dead king who has been taken into the unseen realm as a bull, suggests that ritual slaughter represents death, and ultimately regeneration for the king. Then, those verses are a type of circular stories that are common in pharaonic funerary texts. These stories try to explain people's strange physical problems because of the pharaonic calendar, which had people spontaneously regenerate from life to death, to life to end. In the same way, the killing of bulls and other living sacrifices in the temples of Abusir was a very modern example of the same theme involving solid physical contact between the unseen and visible living worlds. These acts were done in the name of the king and were meant to separate the visible living world from the dead while feeding both and the living. In a later version of the same circular theme, a pharaoh is said to have regenerated by masturbation, and another is called the bull of his mother. This is the standard way of showing incest as a way to reproduce, and it can be found in the pyramid texts' stories about related acts among the family of state gods. The key to this multi-layered reinterpretation of the Cannibal Hymn lies in King Wenis's identification as the bull of the sky. in a passage of the text that Breasted did not include in his translation due to its exceptional obscurity. The problem was not Breasted's command of the ancient language, for he was a considerable philologist. But, as Gardner noted in a study of an ambiguous document from the same period, the problem lay in the language itself. The translator's statement on the text itself. The only basis for preferring one rendering over another once grammar and dictionary requirements have been satisfied and there remains considerable room for divergence is an intuitive appreciation of the ancient author's mind. Due to his interest in cannibalism, Breasted only saw that verse as stating that the king lives on the being of every god, eating their organs, which come with their belly filled with charms. Like other members of the Berlin Seminar, Breasted believed ancient Egyptians of the Old Kingdom were primitive, and their savage ways had been inherited by ancient Egyptians of later eras. Ehrman himself wrote about ancient Egyptian religion in 1904 in an introduction to a handbook for the Berlin Imperial Museums. Those who find the following explanation of Egyptian ideas too simplistic should remember that most of them were conceived by a race of peasants who were naked and half-savage. We inherited these ideas from ancient Egyptians, who were the subjects of Cheops, Amenemhet, and Ramses. Ehrman judged based on philological analysis, when few Old Kingdom texts had been translated, and its arts and architecture were still little known. Therefore, that vastly difficult period was considered semi-literate, i.e., primitive and largely ahistorical. In fact, until the publication of Ehrman's translation of the Westcar Papyrus in 1890, which tells the tale of Prince Harjadef and the Regal twins, the same view of the Old Kingdom as a semi-literate culture had extended to the Middle Kingdom, which is during which the papyrus is thought to have been composed. New Kingdom texts were relatively plentiful in the 19th century compared to the Old Kingdom texts. You can study these texts in European museums, Egyptian tombs and temples, and Champollion's old hunting grounds. Thus, in a brief outline of Egyptian history published in 1894, Ehrman covers all the earlier periods of pharaonic history in a few pages, but also includes reign-by-reign narratives of a succession of pharaohs of the New Kingdom, which he tells in 19th century terms of war and conquest. Accordingly, it is no surprise that he described the New Kingdom as prosperous, splendid, and having emerged from darkness. The unfortunate image of Breasted's jungled pharaoh resulted from a similar view of the primitive, which was influenced by contemporary descriptions of some of the sub-Saharan cultures encountered during the so-called scramble for Africa. The colonizers saw African rituals and rites that were very different from their own, so they thought they were crazy and violent and couldn't tell the difference between reality, magic, and superstition. They thought these people were in a primitive state, which also explained why those societies had such a bad social and moral order. Many scholars thought such cultures were living examples of early pharaonic civilization. Breasted's commentaries offer a somewhat optimistic spin on Berlin's usual attitudes by tracing the evolution of moral principles in Sethi's pyramid texts. Ehrman and Seth belonged to a less malleable background. As Ehrman had written in 1886, the ancient Egyptians lived in a complex and monotonous landscape that produced a prosaic population and pale and formless gods, unlike the Greeks, who had set joyous youthful deities on Mount Olympus with their snow-capped mountains, their sea-foamed winds, and flower-decked meadows. Winckelmann had long concluded that the cultures of the Persians, Phoenicians, and Egyptians were lower than the Greeks, more primitive and less civilized. He noted that even their bodies and their laws, customs, and religions had been less finely crafted and less noble. By his late Romantic vision, Winckelmann had cleaved European images of the past into those cultures that existed before the Classical era and emerged afterward. As a result of this vision, Westerners tried to imagine a primitive world in which humans lived in harmony with plants and animals without the constraints and inhibitions of Christian civilization. The idea of the primitive as a dawn land, as humanity's childhood, and as a universal stage in human development fit well with the ideas of the Enlightenment and Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin said that early humans were as sexually promiscuous as gorillas, which supported European imperialism's goal to bring lower races up to the light. In a later stage, it could serve as an explanation for European disasters, such as the First World War, which could be considered relapses or descents into temporary primitiveness. For example, Reisner and Borchardt studied with Ehrman and discussed the beautiful architecture of Giza, Abu Sir, and other ancient Egyptian sites in terms of magic and primitive religion. They used words from early anthropological studies of Indian and African cultures. Likewise, the concept that the texts found in the pyramids originated in a land of primitive religion served to isolate those dark columns of hieroglyphics from the living world that drew them. In the words of Harold Hayes, one of the foremost commentators on the pyramid texts, "Without the agent and event, history cannot exist." Historically, it would be more illuminating to examine the pyramid texts as they were carved on the pyramid walls, as part of contemporary courtly ceremonies of offering, sculpture, and construction. Since they do not appear to have been intended as a national religion or theological record, the sculpting acts in the dim light of the pyramid took on a new meaning. Dark reading. You need a ladder and a torch to read the columned texts within a pyramid today. Throughout those rooms and corridors, the order varies depending upon the placement and the light available, as well as the choices each individual makes as they move through them. No predetermined order dictated the writing of those texts. Therefore, neither a single reading nor their arrangement is definitive. What then are they saying? The chisel marks of the sculptors and their correcting guidelines show many changes, corrections, and errors. This fact, coupled with the notes that the scribes have inserted into those texts, noting that the exemplar from which a verse was copied was either damaged or incomplete, indicates that those scribes and artisans were adapting the columns of well-crafted hieroglyphs from models written in a calligraphic hand on scrolls. Scrolls similar to those held by the priest figures in the wall scenes of modern tomb chapels and temples. New studies of the texts have shown that, contrary to what Maspero and Seth thought at the time, the verses carved into Wenis's pyramid are not an editio princeps of those carved in later pyramids. These verses are not clearer or clearer than those carved in later pyramids. They are actually the oldest examples of the pyramid texts. These texts suggest that they have been recast into vertical columns of formal hieroglyphs, after being transferred from elaborate, long-lost archives and taken to the pyramids in scrolls. These texts do not follow a single linear narrative, unlike the contemporary royal letters, which were also recopied onto the walls of the nobles' tomb chapels and related to specific events. Despite their vigorous rhetorical qualities, they are not scripts of the rites of pharaonic burial. Those noisy words contain no guidance, direction, or explanation. Although a distant living world shaped and ordered them, their coherence has largely disappeared. As with many of old Egypt's relics, the texts contained within the pyramids are traces of actions and activities that bound and defined the state of being. It includes spontaneous and ritualized reactions to dying, the division of body and spirit, and the dead's journey from the living cities to the western desert and the living universe. These reactions are like those depicted in courtly statues and in the forms of pyramids and tombs. They are intimations of realms beyond the mundane, and like music, ritual slaughter, and incense smoke, they aim to connect and synchronize with the life-giving energies within the valley of the Lower Nile. As with specific texts and wall reliefs in the nobles' tomb chapels, some of the verses in the pyramid texts express pure grief. Gods like Osiris and Re expanded their roles as the state bureaucracy developed, especially in the later pyramids. In contrast, others speak of offerings and funerals. In that sense, they chime with what Maspero and Sethi implied. But the texts together cover a wide range of topics, from the death and rebirth of kings, based on the lunar and solar years, to procreation in the lions of the desert and of Sirius to the country of sand with grasshoppers, fish and birds, as well as fields of silt, with seeds sprouting and sand moving in on the grasshoppers, fish and birds. In the 19th century, the notion of a primitive lower stage of human development was extended to encompass virtually all cultures not of European descent, along with aspects of these so-called primitive cultures. Different new academic fields have started to study and classify ancient and modern cultures, including their different languages, religions, arts, social structures, histories, ethnicities, and physical traits. Renowned academics, known as the fathers of the modern social sciences, conducted several of these studies. Caricatures of the same vision, distorted and politicized during the 1920s and 1930s, gave a scientific pedigree to students who burned un-German books in the court of Berlin University, to those who chased Ehrman's Jewish students into exile, and to the newly appointed professors of Egyptology, all of whom were products of the Berlin seminars and gave lectures in Nazi uniform at Göttingen and Leipzig. During the 1890s, when Ehrman's colleagues and students began to branch out from pure philology and conduct pioneering studies in ancient Egyptian chronology, art history and architecture, Ehrman's vision of primitive pharaonic society began to permeate other areas of ancient Egyptian culture. The scribes and engravers who engraved the signs and verses upon the walls of the pyramids, like Abusir's slaughterers and the builders of the royal court, were crossing back and forth between the seen and unseen that had long been established by that culture. Living and dead, the pharaoh, his people and the gods lived in harmony through acts of offering and building that were statewide and transubstantiated. Here we are, get to know the courtiers. About 1,000 freestanding statues of the courtiers of the Memphite kings have survived to the present, as have fragments of many more. 3 centuries of cheery, bright-eyed faces that once pierced through the millennial darkness of their tomb chapels and now shine under the spotlights of the world's museums. Facing a time when cameras, mirrors and literature were rare, self and other images were different from what they are today. Back then, people's lives were confined in tiny bubbles. This period was marked by gossip rather than news, with most people in the Lower Nile region residing in farming settlements along their vast river. The more significant part of the glorious body of sculpture in the courtiers' tomb chapels resulted from the increasing availability of copper during the reigns of Abusir and Saqqara, along with the explosion of reliefs and texts. The patrons of many of these later works did not have a close relationship with the pharaoh, as they did in those exact times, unlike most of the sculptures and reliefs created during the Giza era. As one of the last century's commentators observed, there has never been a middle-class sculpture of such extraordinary quality before. 80 years earlier, Mariette, who excavated many statues, viewed them as chic as contemporary Parisians. Mostly named and titled with hieroglyphics engraved on their bases, and most of the time washed in hot ochre pigments from the desert. These riotous sculptures depicted these warring regiments of scribes and dwarfs, courtiers and princes, wives and daughters during the reign of the Giza kings. In addition to their sculptural excellence, they are magnificent in person and bearing. The first known example of a scribe statue can be found in several broken fragments, which have confirmed that the open papyrus on the lap of a seated man was made as an image of senior male members of the royal household. At present, the oldest known examples inscribed with a cartouche of Khufu and the name of the royal prince Kawab have been found in the mastaba of that prince, which lies in the Great Pyramid's eastern cemetery. It is similar to that of Haji-Def. These princes, like Haji-Def, were masters of hieroglyphic writing. The quality of those early stony scribes' fragments is equal to that of their kings' statues, which are the main products of their royal workshops. Following generations, the seated scribe pose that had originally been sculpted in various hard desert stones was replicated in the soft white limestone used for most courtiers' statues. Following earlier models, made in the royal workshops, the eyes of some of these scribal statues were inlaid with shining stones. White alabaster mounted in copper set deeply into the dry red-painted limestone so that the eye's orbs seemed alive and moist. A cornea in these alabaster inlays was sometimes drilled and filled with a cylinder of highly polished clear rock crystal, backed with a circular copper iris, with a small hole at its center to represent a pupil. Startlingly natural is the effect. In the old royal pose and with a slight smile of confidence on their lips, those sculptures' shining eyes seem to follow you attentively around the room, as if a scribe were poised to write and wait for you to speak, an effect cleverly enhanced by the sculptor's slight offsetting of the two bright eyes, creating the illusion that they are always moving. At first glance, the tricks may seem more appropriate for waxworks than stone sculptures. The stone figures' clear, bright eyes set them in this half-zone between death and life, past and present, and they are a logical extension of the ancient artisans' obsession with filling their works with energy. As a result of their success, when Mariette's Saqqara workmen first uncovered Ka Appa's mud brick mastaba and revealed the now celebrated silhouette of a middle-aged man, the wooden sculpture with its inlaid eyes had held such a presence that they recognized it instantly as the village headman, the Sheikh El Beled, as the statue inscribed with Ka Appa's name still bears. Embedded in black wigs and fine linens, the mass of Courtier's statues are images of sturdy, well-proportioned individuals, some sensual, some as coldly formal as a diagram of the ideal human form. But each of them posed with their heads aloft, looking forward with confidence, and each with a quality of life. The sculptors can carve 2 or even 3 images of the same subject side by side within the same stone block, such as the statues of Rawa seated and standing within the serdabs of the Courtier's tomb chapel. Alternatively, they could depict their subjects at different stages of their lives, from childhood to middle age, mostly clad, though sometimes naked, with females always young and draped in sheer linens, usually in a pair statue, man and woman. The sexes may appear more prominent in these groups of sculptures than their sculptural companions, but they still hold the same soft electricity stored in the gestures of Menkar's sculptural companions. The sculptors sometimes rang surprising changes. The image Seneb, the dwarf, for instance, with its tiny legs crossed scribal style upon the block that passes for a sculptured chair in such small-scale works, shows 2 children standing side by side in front of the dwarf's image, occupying the space usually occupied by its 2 sturdy legs. Menkar's siltstone goddesses held their king as proudly as Seneb sat beside his wife. Although both their inlaid eyes have been removed, a splendid life-size dark-wood statue thought to represent Senedjamib Mehi displays an air of cold command, as one would expect of high officials today. The same artisans who decorated Courtier's tombs made most nobles' statues. The most spectacular pieces of the nobles' funerary ensemble, such as Nyang Sekhmet's immense false door and Senedjamib Inti's granite sarcophagus, were created as royal favours in the court's workshops. Therefore, the families of the commissioning courtiers would have supported the sculptors, as indicated by the agreements recorded in some of these tomb chapels. Since these craftsmen's studios are independent, the sculpture's poses, iconography, and noblemen's hands, heads, and faces may vary. Alternatively, some of these idiosyncrasies may have stemmed from dialogues between artisans and their patrons, reflecting the aspirations of nobles like Kawab, Seneb, and Senedjamib Mehi to appear as well-rounded individuals. As a reversal of earlier practices, the nobles' sculptures sometimes influence the royal workshops. As a result, the poses in the statues of the Giza kings, which had been the models for many of the earlier nobles' works, were restricted to large blocks of tough stone. On the other hand, the nobles' sculptures were usually made of wood or soft white limestone. Ka Appa's wooden sculpture, for example, has limbs that move freely and openly in space, and are made from several separate blocks attached to pegs. It's interesting to see how these lively images freed later royal sculpture from the strict shapes that the hard stone coalition imposed. This is shown in some later royal statues, which show South Saqqara kings sitting on thrones, but their limbs and other shapes rise freely from the stone. As the later ages progressed, the austerity of the earlier sculptures gave way to a kind of mannerism. The gigantic complete forms of the Giza workshops were thinned down, their waists were nipped in, and their eyes were widened. In addition, this may be especially true in provincial work. Both the courtiers and the royal sculptures were treated differently. The new attenuated forms are veiled within an elastic skin of realism. At the same time, the royal sculptors abandoned hard desert stone in favor of softer and lighter materials like alabaster and copper sheets, which could easily be worked into such silky surfaces. Throughout the century, the sculptors of kings and courtiers worked with the same set of poses and followed the same method of drawing and proportion. The artisans consistently upheld a close relationship with the system, ensuring it remained unaltered or distorted. This was part of the visual language of a courtly culture that sought to transform every day into aspects of an unseen world. Those massive sculptures set within the darkness of the courtiers' tomb chapels had been made for people who knew that when they died, those sculptures would become invisible just as they would, but who believed that their living presence would remain within the world hidden from sight. Titles and ranks. The English will quake when they hear they are returning to Egypt, to the garlic and onions of a kingdom, if His Highness makes you dukes and earls. Hasselrig, Sir Arthur. He was a parliamentarian, a 1657 hereditary prince, an accurate count, an overseer of all the king's works, a keeper of the secrets of his orders, a favourite of the king wherever he went, honoured by Weny, king of the valley and the delta, and a possessor of honour with the great god, Senejemib Mehi, Dictionary of the English Language. In the past, the epithets and titles carved in tomb chapels and on statues of courtiers were thought to represent the parts of a very well-organised government. This last paragraph sums up that view. The general consensus among Egyptologists has been that since Champollion's time, Pharaoh's people shared a traditional European understanding of class and translated the courtiers' titles according to the order of pharaonic society. Since the pharaonic state constructed mighty pyramids and was, as Gardner states, the best organized civilization the world has ever seen, it is easy to assume that these same epithets and titles referred to the tasks assigned to its higher echelons. While many inscriptions clearly name common jobs like sailors, potters, farm workers, goldsmiths, etc., the courtiers' epithets and titles are so numerous and vague that it is impossible to figure out what role they may have played in the pharaonic hierarchy. Because the state order described in most courtiers' epithets and titles has undergone several significant changes, it is nearly impossible to determine their practical purposes today. When the first pharaohs ruled the land for the first time, the few recorded titles reflected the king's advancement as his attendants travelled with him and held tithing courts at various locations along the Lower Nile. The king's immediate entourage would hold those duplicate titles 3 millennia later. Then, the construction of the colossal pyramids reversed these archaic collection processes. The Lower Nile produce was shipped to Memphis, and while the number of recorded courtly titles had increased considerably, most still belonged to people close to the royal household, whose tombs still stand on the echelon of the Giza Plateau. The epithets and titles of these kings do not accurately describe their physical relationship to the king, just as they do not identify occupations connected to the government's consuming task, the construction of mighty monuments. Building one of the Giza pyramids can only be described as a project organized by unidentified officials leading an anonymous team, except Royal Prince Ankh-Haf, described in a recently discovered papyrus as overseeing stone deliveries to the Giza Plateau. The courtiers' epithets and titles increased from 100 to over 1,000 during Abusir and Saqqara's reigns, when the court's supply and governance changed. The proliferation of epithets and titles may have been fueled by the number of decorated tomb chapels and the relocation of some courtiers into the provinces. In contrast, the deployment of court officials into the areas had probably distanced those courtiers from day-to-day contact with the royal residents, creating a written command system. All in all, the inscriptions reveal that the few spare titles held by early courtiers had been augmented, reign by reign, century by century, by an overabundance of new epithets and titles. Some were ancient terms, reflecting roles and affiliations within the pharaoh's family. Others were honorifics or given as mortuary favors after death. However, others may have described an actual function in pharaonic government or a single task successfully performed. These epithets and titles have been the subject of several close analyses in the past half-century. Nevertheless, the results have been so inconclusive that it is impossible to know what some represent. Sir Alan Gardner says, "Valiant attempts have been made to bring life and reality to the titularies, whose graves are so lavish. But there is no denying the highly precarious nature of the results." We can well imagine those grandiose Orientalist bureaucracies whose directors held titles like overseers of the royal documents of works of the treasury of the granaries to be nothing more than mirages. What responsibilities did the overseers of the royal documents, such as librarians and archivists, have? Were they responsible for the day-to-day operations as well? Did the overseers design and supervise the pyramids? Or were they responsible for overseeing the craftsmen's workshops and the kingdom's agriculture and canals? In the old days, did the overseers of the granaries control the tithing of the harvests or the storage silos? Did the treasury overseers distribute collected treasure, or did they simply tally tithes? There are also the meanings of a number of these seemingly straightforwardly translated titles, including general and priest. Through the millennia, so have the tasks of the gentleman usher of the Black Rod of the House of Lords, a position currently held by a military officer, a lieutenant general, companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, commander of the most excellent order of the British Empire, once chairman of the National Children's Orchestra, and Director General of the European Union Military Staff in the Council of the European Union. In a similar vein, the texts found in the tomb chapels of courtiers suggest that they too were involved in multiple tasks at various points in time. They were diplomats, priests, militia captains, mine supervisors, sailors, accountants, builders, and controllers of quarries, royal workshops, or temple musicians as required, rather than specialized professionals or ministries as in more modern governments. Although these painstaking analyses revealed some more permanent government structures within the Memphite court, others remained hidden. Additionally, more than 80 courtiers over 300 years are known to have borne the Sheet's title, a word that in the 19th century was used by officials in the Ottoman Empire and the Sublime Porte at Constantinople. This pharaonic viziers group also bore a second title, My Pet, which appears on relics associated with the first pharaoh and has been held by individuals close to pharaohs down through the millennia. A vizier was first appointed during the days of the colossal pyramids, when it was held exclusively by members of the royal household titled King's Sons, a title that does not necessarily imply that they were the physical offspring of the king. During that period, viziers were often called He of the Curtain or He of the Door, implying that they provided chamberlain-like service to royal audiences. In later times, alternatively, the title of vizier was used by officials like Senejemib Inti, who were directly involved with royal projects and who appeared close to the king, although they were not members of his household and might well have served several monarchs in succession. In turn, the families of those viziers sometimes supplied viziers to the court. These viziers may also be called hereditary princes, chiropodists, and butlers, adding to the confusion. Vizier Ptah Shapes held considerable power at the court of the Abusir kings and was a senior courtier, as his title would imply. According to the texts of the mastaba of the Vizier Ptah Shapes that stands next to the pyramids of Abusir, he served not fewer than 6 successive monarchs, in roles ranging from the keeper of the royal diadem to the custodian of the sacred writings of the gods. Even so, the epithets and tags on his tomb chapel, that sonorous and scrambled mass of ambiguity, hardly provide a complete history of the man or his time. The illusion that Pharaoh's Egypt was a fantasy version of a modern state in which Margaret Thatcher had been appointed Prime Minister after the Queen found her mending the roof of Buckingham Palace is what traditional historians have attempted to convey by suggesting Ptah ships had risen up a ladder of success, and that his vizier's monument was due to his physical relationship with Pharaoh as a hairdresser and royal nail clipper. Historically, pharaonic society was less socially aggressive and more integrated than most modern people might think. Land and society. Ordering the kingdom. Even though we now consider the French aristocracy of the Ancien regime to be a class, this idea didn't emerge until much later. The question is, who is the Count of X? Instead of a member of the aristocracy, the standard answer would be the Lord of X, the uncle of the Baron de Y, or a client of the Duc de Z. Bennett Anderson, 1991. The sheltered hothouse of the Lower Nile offered the best living conditions in Bronze Age Egypt. Essentially, it was a face-to-face, small-scale farming society. Writers and courtiers dealt directly with the minutiae of everyday life. Erring servants, delayed materials and deliveries, and the loss of a workday when a pyramid gang's clothing ration arrived late. Placing the blocks in the 4 colossal pyramids reflects the same mindset. Some graffiti shows that their production was the responsibility of small gangs of quarriers and craftsmen. Overall, the Giza pyramid results from the many small teams that cut the stones with integrity and care and set them as straight and true as the irrigation ditches in the fields along the Nile. A consistent and masterful policy facilitated the coordination and direction of smaller gangs. Therefore, the accuracy and consistency of the Great Pyramid can be attributed to both the rural workforce and firm, and the subtle pharaonic administration over the long years it took to build it. Thus, the culture of this state was not made by brute force or national boundaries, but by the royal residence, the court's rituals, the building yards, and the artisans' workshops. Both large and small households fundamentally composed the state. Memphite courtiers' households revolved around the royal court, and in turn, these courtly households were the nuclei of the families of craftsmen and scribes, servants, and farmers. These families were sometimes named and pictured in courtiers' tomb chapels, where they are remembered fondly. During that time, the provincial courtiers' households were modelled on those of the court they served, to the extent that many of their tomb chapels had cemeteries of more unadorned graves, mainly shaft and pit graves, laid out in the little deserts at the foot of the valley's cliffs, in the manner of the Memphite cemeteries. According to the bones, these were the graves of the heads of smaller families, primarily farmers, some of whom appear to have performed a role similar to that of village headmen, a position that in the late Old Kingdom was recognized formally by the court officers. The exact order that characterizes the living court lies within its cemeteries, and the same can also be seen in the farmers' little cemeteries upon the lower slopes of the Nile-side deserts beyond their fields. The contents of those tombs change from the time of the Giza kings to Abusir and Saqqara, just like in the tomb chapels of modern courtiers and kings. The sites that most clearly demonstrate those changes were excavated by George Reisner during the first decade of the 20th century, along with the Giza Plateau's cemeteries and temples. Located about 12 miles from Abydos, close to the contemporary village of Naga El-Der, these rural cemeteries are part of a continuous band of burial grounds of varying ages that stretches for miles along the edges of a broad silt plain whose bountiful crops of wheat and barley, lentils, beans and millet make it still one of the most fertile regions in the Nile Valley. During the 4 colossal pyramids, Most of the tombs at Naga El-Der were simple pits marked by mounds of sand and stones or rough-made mud brick walls. Their arrangement paralleled that of the Giza courtiers, with clusters of these graves grouped around a line of small mastaba structures. There were no descriptors on the graves, although a splendid diorite bowl engraved with Sneferu's name was found in the burial chamber of one of the brick mastabas. Reisner suggested that this had been a royal gift to the village headman. According to this pattern, the dead lived in settlements where a single household had overseen local farmers for generations. Following the abandonment of the colossal pyramids, the goods of the following generations were buried at Naga El-Der in cemeteries, reflecting the changing nature of pharaonic society. Earlier burials contained few objects, mainly brought from living households, but later graves contained more things and were generally of higher quality, some containing jewelry and seals made especially for burial. Inscriptions bear the names of the dead within these graveyards. Titles such as overseer of herds suggest that their occupants may have contributed to cattle supply to sun temples, for example. The Sakra kings engraved and painted provincial governors and priests' names and titles on limestone flakes left on gravestones in these little cemeteries. It's not written in courtly hieroglyphs, but in a style similar to the calligraphy that bureaucrats used in their daily work. These simple texts and the tomb chapels of modern courtiers show how the kingdom's order was becoming clearer. In later times, the grave furnishings of the people of Naga El-Der became even more lavish, with Reisner cataloguing almost 500 amulets interred within the burials. Hence, during the period of Abusir and Saqqara, the households that created the cemeteries in Naga El-Der had herds and harvests sufficient to sustain the court and its extensive building programs, while increasing the size and prosperity of their communities. Therefore, the Memphite court's decision to reduce the size of the royal pyramids changed not only the rhythm, scope, and culture of the court, but also improved the lives of the communities that sustained it. The pharaoh and his subjects shared the prospect of a common destiny together with a thread of common culture that runs from the graves of the farmers to the tombs of kings at every burial site in Egypt. Naga El-Der also housed courtiers and kings, ensuring their bodies remained healthy and in good condition. So the fact that the whole kingdom's resources were used, that goods and food were shipped to Memphis from all over the kingdom, and that thousands and thousands of farmers helped build the royal pyramids, shows how effective and powerful the courtly culture was. In contrast to rural communities and households, the people of the Lower Nile had been taught skills that were neither typical nor required for subsistence farming. But the farmers of the Lower Nile were not entirely unaware of the extensive cooperative labor involved in pyramid building. The people of the farming settlements had worked together in groups to cut canals and maintain irrigation systems since prehistoric times, which must have fostered a sense of power and value of community among the people. The building of pyramids had, at least in that sense, extended these communal activities to the furthest corners of the kingdom and gathered them in the court of Memphis. Pyramid building has traditionally been described as corvée labor, derived from a medieval system of forced labor in which peasants worked unpaid in fields of the local lord, or had been conscripted by French courts for road building, which was brutally adapted by European masters for construction of the Suez Canal in the 19th century. The structure of such monuments during the Old Kingdom was not characterized by that same brutality, nor was it supported by the high level of precision and organization necessary to achieve its goal. Many skilled workers worked to build pyramids and temples over decades with considerable concentration, a quality not generally associated with conscription and bully tactics. While the scenes within the courtiers' tomb chapels provide glimpses of the tenor of the times, little is known about the social interaction between the court and the rest of society. Later, the tradition that courtiers should follow a strictly defined code of behavior was attributed to the Memphite kings of Giza and Abusir, and many lengthy texts describe that code in great detail. Many documents from that era have survived, including the Instructions of Harjadef, which the ancient scribes considered one of the earliest texts. Gardner describes the virtues listed in these instructions as obeying fathers and superiors, keeping silent in all circumstances, displaying good manners in social interaction, faithfulness in delivering messages, and a humility short of subservience. In one of the long texts, the Vizier Ptahhotep encourages his son, "You will dominate like a crocodile," a sentiment the elderly Sir Alan Gardner endorsed. A robust code of conduct exists within households of all sizes, and a population of about 1 million people outside the orbit of the Memphite court. Along the Lower Nile, household sizes varied widely, from the king's and courtiers' estates and farming colonies, to smaller holdings suggested by the smaller graves at Naga el-Deir. But just as little is known about how the different estates and households, big and small, were connected to each other. There is also not much known about who owned the land that is recorded, or whether terms like freehold, leasehold, tenancy, and others existed in the pharaonic state. Pharaohs and their gods controlled the surveying and land measurement of those flat silt plains, which were the sites of various farms. This is not surprising, since floods tended to obscure field boundaries. During the reign of the Memphite kings, much of the floodplain wasn't farmed. This suggests that pharaonic land surveys weren't about proving who owned certain plots in the way we think of it today. Instead, they were about planning the layout of crops and irrigation systems, and figuring out how big each harvest was. The texts specify that everything eventually devolved to the pharaoh, although, like a feudal system, rights to the exploitation of various holdings passed from generation to generation within the same household. A handful of surviving texts record transactions, such as land transfers and ceding funerary estates to cults of deceased people, undertaken in front of witnesses. What survives is often fragmented and ambiguous. In the texts, however, a pharaonic society has operated under a code of social obligations, which sometimes required some form of state arbitration and punishment. This system was so widespread that some of its verses appear in the pyramid texts, which insist that the dead king should not be subjected to such treatments. Pepi was one of that remarkable group born in Heliopolis who were never taken by a king, brought before officials accused or found guilty. This is true of Pepi. He will not suffer. He will not be carried off on behalf of a king. He will not be brought before officials. And the opponents of Pepi will not triumph. Pepi will not hunger. His fingernails will not grow long, and no bone in him will be broken. Goal. Indignant letters addressed to members of the community of the ever-present dead are filled with rage resulting from lengthy disputes, displaying the living basis of the code of social conduct: personal pledges, household honor, precedence, and possession. A widow addresses her deceased partner. Here is a reminder of what you said. May the wood of the bed that bears me rot, should a man's son be prevented from using his household furniture. Actually, the woman Wabut has joined Izezi, and they have destroyed your household. She has removed everything to enrich Izezi and impoverish your son. What will you do? You could bring me to your side so I could be beside you, rather than having your son dependent on Izzy. Hey! Wake up! Then rouse yourselves against them, your fathers, brothers, relatives. And once again, Shepsi's mother, addresses him as follows. You once commanded me, your son, to bring you some quails I may eat. It reminds me of when you told me to bring you 7 quails and you ate them. I would appreciate it if you decided between me and Sobekotep, who I brought back from another settlement to be interred among his companions after giving him his shroud, when there is nothing I said or did to cause him to injure me, your son, so wrongfully. The gods don't like wrongdoing. Around the world. The surviving documentation indicates that the era of the Memphite pharaohs was one of peace. The court spent its surpluses on building pyramids, tombs, and temples, and there were no enemies. Neither the tomb, chapels, temples, or archaeological evidence in the kingdom indicates the existence of a military caste or culture. Due to this seeming passivity, ancient Egypt is often referred to as a culture isolated by modern standards. This may be true by current means. In ancient times, however, there were few people around. The contemporary Levantine populations of Palestine, Syria, and Anatolia, aside from the city-states located along the Tigris and Euphrates, were tiny compared to their pharaohs' kingdoms. Their courts were often short-lived, small in size and number, and aggressive. Even so, there is a lot of evidence that these changing cultures interacted with the court of Memphis. This direct descendant of the ancient trade in lapis lazuli, amber, and obsidian that linked faraway places like the Baltic, Afghanistan, Mesopotamia, and Sudan. It is hardly surprising that many of the nobles' mastaba chambers in Giza and Saqqara also contained quantities of Levantine pottery. The pieces also had exotic resin pieces from far-flung places. The Lower Nile's courtly culture was characterized by oils, wines, and other products that could only be grown in northern and temperate zones. Likewise, many of the woods used for pharaonic furniture and boats, cedar, juniper, yew, box, cypress, and hornbeam, came from the north. Cedar wood, in particular huge quantities cut from ancient forests in Lebanon, was used extensively in the construction of pharaonic boats and barges, tombs and temples, and state buildings such as doorways and columns. Since the creation of pharaonic culture, copper was imported from the mines and furnaces of southern Jordan along the so-called King's Highway, which ran through those copper fields to the port of Aqaba on the northeastern Red Sea coast, where it was shipped or sent by caravan to Memphis. A second ancient land bridge connected the Levant to the Nile Delta, the so-called Way of Horus, followed the Lebanese coastline along the eastern Mediterranean. The 500-mile trip was not suitable for transporting heavy cargoes, and most of that traffic was sent down the shipping lanes running parallel to that coast, from the Levantine ports into the Nile's delta. A week-long voyage that, in the best sailing season, in ships without navigation aids, would have involved travelling by day and spending the night in ports or on the seashore. Thus, many traditional imports from the Levant regions further north, exotica, such as lapis lazuli, silver, and amber, were long sent down into the part of the Lower Nile by these fixed routes. This ancient traffic had ceased at the time of the archaic kings, probably due to disturbances in those regions. The archaeological record of the kings of Giza reveals the return of these traditional imports. Growing trade continues in the subsequent periods, to the point that some of the temple reliefs of Abusir show foreign boats, and their distinctive imports being transported to a royal audience. There are large oil jars whose shapes are well suited for stowing within the curving hulls of wooden vessels. Live brown bears from Syria, quantities of animal skins, along with fruits and other fragile, perishable goods that were exchanged throughout the Caucasus and the Levant, but left virtually no trace today. The ancient port of Byblos in modern-day Lebanon was a major center for this millennial traffic, with warehouses filled with locally made olive oil jars intended for shipping. The Giza mastaba and the glittering tomb chamber of Queen Hetep-Hera, a contemporary of Sneferu and Khufu, also contain large numbers of identical containers. In later times, as the courtiers' households spread out into the provinces, the imported goods that they held were also shipped to the provincial courts, as fragments of the same exotic storage jars and a single courtly text testify, "The Majesty of Merenre, my lord, sent me to Byblos. In addition to the 3 boats I brought back from Byblos, I got lapis lazuli, tin or lead, silver, and safety oil, a perfumed emulsion." He also received every high-quality product he had hoped for. The court praised my efforts and rewarded me with gold. No expedition leader had ever accomplished a feat, nor had any god sent one. In the 2 big ships that bring the products of foreign lands to his god, the Courtier Ini, he is the sole friend, reader, priest, and seal-bearer of the powerful god of the West. As early as 2300 BC, when that text was inscribed within Ini's tomb chapel at Saqqara, there was courtly communication between Byblos and the Memphite court, that the much-travelled noble inn so obligingly describes had been well established. However, his text is unique. Only a few fragments of that traffic have survived, including this recently recovered written record. A bartering or trade system does not exist. Pharaonic goods and provisions, probably wheat, fine linens, and some durable products from the workshops of Memphis, were sent to the Northlands for these imports. Byblos, for example, is the site where fine stone jars and round stone offering tables, bearing the names of Khufu, Hetep-Her, and other later kings were discovered in and around the temple precinct. The architecture features distinct pharaonic elements measured and laid out in Egyptian cubits. Some Memphite items refer to a temple within the Temple Baalat Garbal as the Lady of Byblos, suggesting they were sent abroad as gifts to a goddess who, as a pharaonic seal found within the temple shows, had been equated with the goddess Hathor. In excavations in settlements across the eastern Mediterranean and the Levant, similar courtly products that incorporated hard desert stones, gold, and shining alabaster have been discovered. From ancient Ugarit on the beautiful Syrian coastline by modern Latakia, several excavations have been made in Crete, Palestine, and Ebla, a remarkable ancient city on the edge of the higher Euphrates basin, as well as in Anatolia, where, in the 1950s, strips of gold bearing the name of Sahur were thought to have been attached to a box or palanquin made in Abusir's workshops and sent to the ruler of a court unknown to us. However, sound. Scholars have traditionally claimed that the pharaonic foreign policy included the far-flung discoveries of products from the Memphite workshops. As tokens of respect and obligation between two courtly households engaged in ancient exchange systems, they are part of an ageless trade-in delight and esoteric that served the old Middle Eastern courts. The great explorers, desert boats and donkeys. The Memphite court imported copper ingots from Jordan, Palestine, and places further north, and operated many copper mines. The millennial presence. People who worked as copper miners for Pharaoh were in that remote area because there were inscriptions and reliefs in the deep red rock of southwestern Sinai. They smelted copper ore near where they worked and dug up the area's signature fine blue turquoise. In eastern and western deserts, gold and copper ores were mined sporadically, and rare stones were quarried too. Khafras and the hawk statues were crafted from gneiss sent from the Nubian desert, and many of Menkaura's statues were made from stone quarried in the eastern desert. Alabaster from Hatnub quarries near the modern town of Malawi, near the Nile, was employed in the royal workshops. Donkeys, boats, and barges gained prominence in this considerable traffic, and their images can be found in tomb chapels and temples depicting donkey herds, seagoing vessels, and giant barges, with monolithic granite columns affixed to their decks. The drawing of columns on a barge is based on reliefs found in Wenis's causeway, one largely intact element of this extensive transport system, and perhaps the rarest of all the surviving relics preserved since the time of the Memphite pharaohs, was found in 2008 on the bleak western shores of the Red Sea, some 90 miles south of the modern port of Suez, at a site now known as the Wadi El Jarf. An ancient port from Khufu's time lies here, with ruins of its artificial harbour and a 120-yard-long L-shaped mole extending straight into the sea. Nearby, Pierre Talad and his team excavated and mapped two chandleries whose plans resembled Giza's magazines. However, seagoing vessels' barnacled anchors partially surrounded the stones here. The French archaeologists opened 30 caves that served as the ancient port's warehouses 3 miles inland, deep in the limestone ridge behind the coastline. We found timbers and ropes from boats and hundreds of globular water pots within the all-preserving desert dryness. The discovery proved that, like their northern neighbours, the ancient pharaohs' ships also sailed the seas. Next to the warehouses were 3 potteries that produced distinctive water pots. Several miles inland and beyond the warehouses at the lonely monastery of St. Paul, there is a solitary spring that might have been used to hold the waters. This rare water source would undoubtedly have determined the port's location on that barren, arid coast, and it would have supported the 300 men who lived and worked there. The amount of smashed ceramics within the settlement and in the harbour suggests that the same spring water was transported 30 miles across the Red Sea to another desert settlement on the Sinai Peninsula. It was built in the dunes above the northern end of the El Marka Plain, a 5-mile-wide wash of sand and gravel that lies north of the oil fields of Abu Rodis, in clear sight of Wadi El Jarf. It was a solid 144-foot-wide circular stone enclosure that was unique. Khufu's harbour and its supporting installations are located at Wadi El Jarf. Its American discoverers discovered these turquoise chips and copper globules inside the enclosure, suggesting that it served as a staging post and processing station for the copper ores and turquoise matrix extracted from the mountains in the deserts behind the beach. At the same time, the enclosure may have served as a stopping place and shelter for caravans carrying copper ingots from the Levant mines across Sinai, although, as the newfound port at Wadi El Jarf suggests, Levantine copper might have also been shipped by sea directly from the Gulf of Aqaba to the west coast of the Red Sea. This underscores the significance of the recently found Red Sea ports in procuring copper for the pyramids and workshops of the Memphite court during the Old Kingdom. The discovery of inscribed papyri sheets by Talat at the warehouses of Wadi El Jarf indicates the port was part of the supply system that enabled the Great Pyramid of Giza to be constructed. A few of these documents have lists of produce and provisions brought from the Nile Delta and destined for Memphis, written in scribal hands and laid out in the manner of later papyri found in Abbasid temples. Stunningly, some have the daybooks of Mera, an official of Khufu's court, responsible for 200 men. During the final phases of the Great Pyramid's construction, he supervised the shipment of white limestone blocks for several months. Mercer's daybooks not only record his various loads and voyages from the Tura quarries across the Nile to the Giza harbours, they also document the inspection of his cargoes at the dockside offices of the Vizier Ankh-Haf, a prince of the royal household who would be buried in one of Giza's splendid mastabas. These days, books describe work and supply at Giza rather than at Wadi El Jarf, where they were found. This indicates that Mera and his contemporaries were involved in every aspect of state supply systems during the Pharaonic era, and that the Pharaonic transportation system was highly integrated. These unique documents represent the oldest surviving inscribed papyri from ancient Egypt, and they provide the only proof, apart from the colossal pyramids themselves, of the extensive supply systems that enabled pyramid construction. Wadi El Jarf is notable in that old gangs sealed the port's warehouses with enormous blocks of stone, some of which still bear the names of Khufu's work gangs, which slid against the warehouses' doors on ramps of muddy shale and cedar wood slats. No tangible evidence exists of the Great Pyramid's stone workers' methods to move such gigantic stone blocks. The significance of the discoveries at the Wadi El Jarf will echo for years. However, that work is far from over. In any case, much of the copper used for the chisels of masons who made the Great Pyramid had been carried in caravans, along with the turquoise destined for royal artisans, from the mines in the Sinai Mountains down to the circular storehouse on the El Marka Plain, from where it was shipped to the port at Wadi El Jarf. Donkey caravans would have carried the copper and turquoise through the eastern desert, along the Wadi Arabah, and then into the Nile Valley, where they would have been loaded onto ships downstream to Giza and the royal workshops. A crumpled sheet of the Wadi El Jarf papyri is by the entrance to one of the cave magazines at the port. Khufu's successors demonstrated the importance of time in building royal pyramids by relocating from Khufu's port at Wadi El Jarf to a location 60 miles up the coast. This decision ensured the workforce was available, and the pyramid was completed within the king's lifetime. Moving to this new location halved the short sea voyage to the circular caravanserai on the El Marka Plain, and the month-long trek to the western mountains from the Wadi El Jarf. This allowed the copper and turquoise caravans to travel through relatively flat terrain along the modern Cairo-Suez road, and deliver their loads directly to the royal workshops and pyramid construction sites. In the same way as Khufu's port, this new dock and settlement were built next to freshwater sources, such as the hot springs that rise beside Ain Sukna, a seaside resort. From the times of Khafra and later, rock inscriptions at the site show that this new port was home to potteries and copper smelting facilities and remained a strong support network for the state over the following 7 centuries, supplying both turquoise and copper to artisans, masons, and shipbuilders. Evidence from the site, along with old ropes, timber, oars, and sail fragments found within another set of cave-cut warehouses, suggests that the Old Kingdom's Red Sea boats had been built in dockyards along the Nile, then disassembled and transported piece by piece to Ain Sukna, where they were reassembled on the beach. Like Wadi el-Jaf, these boats went to sea with water collected from the nearby springs. Supplies of food and timber for the ships themselves were brought from the valley of the Lower Nile. According to Memphite scribes, these vessels were called Byblos boats, and later examples show that they remained virtually unchanged throughout the next millennium. The different carvings of these Byblos boats and the remaining timbers show that their hulls were about 70 feet long and could have held up to 15 tons. This contrasts the pharaonic stone-carrying barges, which were much bigger. Sahur's temples depict a few of those elegant vessels at the dockside of a delta port with their sails furled and their masts lowered, as if the Byblos boats, in keeping with their names, sailed upon the Mediterranean. The boats also plied the southern Red Sea coast, embarking in late autumn to benefit from the local winds that blow up during the winter months, and bringing products from the Levant to Memphis and turquoise and copper from the Sinai. The Abusir temples describe 2 sailings as voyages to the pharaohs, presented Punt's unique southern products to the exotic land of Punt, or God's land, teas of pharaohs, in the times of Isesi and Sahur, through temple reliefs. Perfumed frankincense and myrrh, exotic pelts, and sapling incense trees for the temple gardens of the Lower Nile. The intrepid mariners of Pharaoh sailed the upper reaches of the Nile long ago. The cataract at Aswan had hindered their progress to the south, particularly during times of flooding when a torrent of white water tore through the granite gorge. But slipways were built to bypass it, allowing riverboats to pass in all seasons so that ancient voyagers could sail to regions beyond the Nubian quarries from which the stone of Khafra's celebrated state had been quarried. Several Memphite scribes and courtiers' names were found on rocks above the wide Nile River near the Nubian villages of Tumas Tuska and Abu Simbel, about 200 miles south of Aswan, before the high dam was built. In Buhan, about 200 miles upstream, where gold and copper ore were abundant, a small mining settlement smelted copper from the times of the Giza kings. More graffiti was found upstream, near El Daka, and at the entrance to the Wadi Alaki near a rich gold deposit. It said that 2 officials from the South Saqqara court were there and may have been looking for rare metals. Other graffiti in the same southern areas talked about trips deep into the eastern deserts. The major caravan routes to and from the Lower Nile Valley were established during the Old Kingdom. Abu Ballas Trail and Darb el Arabian's ancient destinations are unknown. However, their general direction suggests northern Chad and Darfur in central Sudan. In the Sahara, these pharaonic trails struck south and west from the 3 oases of Bahria, Dakhla and Karga, which lie parallel to each other 100 miles west of the Nile Valley, and were connected to the Nile Valley by desert tracks. The Karga oasis, literally the outer and the one furthest from the Nile Valley, had considerable pharaonic settlements as early as the age of the South Saqqara kings, whose leading citizens lived in substantial enclosures and were buried in mud, brick, mastaba tombs. According to the surviving historical records, the officials in those settlements closely observed the desert people, traditionally referred to as Libyans, and tracked their movements. From these oases into the High Sahara required considerable planning, experience and skill, just as the mining expeditions to the Sinai did. In the first millennium BC, before camels were introduced to the Sahara, donkeys were the primary beasts of burden in the valley and the desert, having been domesticated in the first farming settlements in the Lower Nile. Donkeys are equal to camels in desert conditions, and mature animals in good need can carry a load of up to 200 pounds and suffer only 30% dehydration. Thus, on a desert trek, those patient creatures will go 3 days without water before they die of thirst. Caravanners in such extreme conditions had to take considerable care of their animals, setting their loads carefully and with an even balance. Loads mostly made up of the soft water skins made from a single goat pelt, the contents of which could be decanted into the large ceramic jars when the other provisions had been left behind. The donkeys on those expeditions also relied on their drivers' knowledge of the desert, where to find water and forage, and their calculations of the amount of food they needed to carry to ensure the safety of both man and beast. In the summer, when the daytime temperatures were too hot, the drivers travelled by night, guided by the stars and the outline of the terrain they passed through. They had to ensure their donkeys' hooves didn't split from the heat of the sand. So the pharaoh's caravans could have travelled at walking speed for about 12 hours each day. The knowledge required to successfully complete such desert journeys is lost chiefly today, just as it is for those who still drive donkeys in the Sudanese and West African deserts. An inscription on one of the vast stone outcrops that rise like sentinels out of the expanse of the Sahara Plains indicates that, in Khufu's time, one of these desert expeditions was undertaken to obtain a rare desert ochre that the court artisans used as a paint pigment. A caravanner had cooked a pot of loasts on a desert hearth under the shade of that high rock pillar. Some of these ancient encampments were set up by those rocky outcroppings and are still visible today on the surface of the desert by the eggshell shapes of burnt storage jars half buried in the sand. Just as the tracks before were marked by cairns and standing stones, wind shelters, and watchtowers. Known now as the Abu Balas Trail, one of the tracks has been found to connect the oasis of Dakhla with the edge of the Great Sand Sea and the plateau of Gilf Kabir, where another lengthy journey may have passed through that lonely region of dunes and rock, to another oasis from which Lower Nubia and even modern-day Chad would have been reachable. Following Carlo Bergman, the discoverer of this long-lost route through the Sahara, German archaeologists have documented and mapped more than 20 ancient sites along the Abu Balas Trail. Each site is 2 to 3 days caravanning from the next, and all contain sherds and clusters of ancient pottery made in the Dakhla Oasis or the Nile Valley in the time of the Saqqara kings. In places, these way stations look like miniature artificial oases, surrounded by rocky outcrops that provide little shade. Many distinctive ceramic vessels lay intact in the desert before the advent of desert tourism. Before the start, some of those unusual vessels contained about 70 gallons of water and provided shelter for 80 donkeys. As an alternative, other way stations had ovens that baked hundreds of loaves of bread, while the dry sands also preserved donkey harnesses and baskets, and numerous ropes and knots that were indispensable to ancient donkey tackle and tethers as they were to Pharaoh's seagoing sailors. Throughout history, desert trails have served numerous purposes. Ancient cattle herders used this route to move their cattle north through the more temperate savanna of that time to water at the Egyptian oases. Judging from the delightful Neolithic rock paintings found along the Abu Balas Trail. However, several tomb chapel inscriptions from the time of the Saqqara kings indicate desert journeys that may have been much further south and westward to the ranges of the Gebel Uweinat, where Libya, Egypt, and Sudan currently meet. As a text in the tomb chapel of the noble Harkhuf at Aswan appears to describe, Pharaoh's donkey caravans may have journeyed further south from that remote oasis into the Yam region, which the tomb chapel's texts refer to as the land of Yam. I was sent by King Merani travelled with King Merenre and my father Iri to Yam to open the road to this foreign land, to get there. And I returned with 300 donkeys loaded with incense, ebony, oil, aromatics, leopard skins, ivory carvings, boomerangs, and all sorts of good stuff. Although many of the regions named in Harkuf's descriptions of his several southern journeys have yet to be identified, it seems likely that this legendary explorer from Aswan had travelled to the land of Yama along a trail running closer to the Nile than the high desert route of the Abu Balas Trail, a trail that is still well used today and known as Darb el Arba'in, the track of 40 days. Although desert, the desert offers few human comforts. Tracks such as Darb el Arba'in are more direct than routes passing through settlements along the Nile Valley. And, as they are largely devoid of human settlement, they are very discreet. To get to CTS in the 1970s, Nubian camel drivers still carried silver-handled whips and dressed in white desert robes as they carried their trotting herds up through the deserts. It is one of several similar punctuations, a series of shadowed rectangles, carved into a cliff outside Aswan, always a place of quarrymen and travellers, rather than farmers. As well as numerous prayers and offering lists, several texts within these tomb chapels detail epic journeys undertaken by Aswan's leading citizens, who travelled both across the desert and across the sea to Byblos and other Levantine ports, from the Nile Delta ports of Ain Sukna and other tomb chapels. An inscription in a tomb chapel at Aswan records that an adventurer had retrieved his father's body, who had been killed on a similar journey, for burial in the land of the pharaoh. It was, however, not a military expedition, but a series of trips undertaken with modest escorts, primarily devoted to avoiding hostile and unfriendly communities and meeting friendly foreign rulers with gifts and courtly greetings. The travellers also brought back ebony, ivory, incense, and leopard skins worn by the court priests in exchange for wood and copper. Those narratives were so highly regarded that they founded a new literary form that describes the travel from the issuing of the royal warrant through the contact with other cultures, and the triumphant return of the travelling courtiers, laden with precious goods, and their subsequent rewards and honours from the pharaoh. Each text emphasises the unique nature of the travel described, the explorer's close relationship with his king, and the gifts they received on their return. According to his inscription, Harkuf had been sent barges laden with dates, wine, cakes, bread and beer, as the thirsty caravan set out on its journey downstream to Memphis. An example of the pharaoh's delight in exotic outings is a record of a royal letter sent by the young king Pepi II to Harkuf around 2380 BC, engraved on the chapel facade of Harkuf's tomb. The king personally sealed the letter in year 2. On the 15th of the 3rd month of the first season, Harkuf informed His Majesty that, in addition to the usual southern treasures, he was bringing a dancing pygmy to the royal court from the land of the horizon dwellers. During the times of the first kings, dwarfs lived in the royal residence, serving as courtiers, retainers, and entertainment providers, such as the gods' dances. The letter tells Harkuf to sail north as soon as possible to the residence. "Bring him to me healthy," he continues, "and when you take him aboard the ship, assign able men to watch him on deck so he doesn't fall in." The young king promises to give Harkuf rewards that will be remembered for generations if the dancing pygmy arrives alive and well at court. He will assign capable men to sleep around his tent and inspect him 10 times daily. Weny of Abydos, rich and richer. There are surviving texts that generally repeat the same themes and other sources that offer a glimpse of life in the Memphite court. But its scribes and craftsmen were able to fashion identities for several courtiers, men like Hajjadef, Seneb, and Harkuf, that to the modern eye seem more rounded than those of their kings. Yet the image of Seneb, the dwarf, and the lively texts of expedition leaders like Harkuf are hardly typical of the everyday, and the majority of the courtier's readers are formulaic and repetitive, so that, like the kings they served, they become little more than names. This generality, however, does not apply to one courtier and royal confidant, Vizier Weny, whose inscription in his tomb chapel at Abydos describes a long career within the royal household and state government, and includes numerous incidents and adventures. According to Breasted, Weny's 51 vertical columns of hieroglyphs, which are as finely cut as the contemporary pyramid texts, are engraved onto enormous blocks of Tura limestone that are just under 2 feet thick, 10 feet long, and 5 feet tall. Despite Gardner's generally less sanguine judgments, he considered the text an exception to the triviality, from a historical standpoint, of most of the so-called autobiographical inscriptions belonging to the Old Kingdom. Weny's 60-odd years working for Kings Sethi, Pepi I, and Merenre are reflected in the text engraved upon those fine white stones. Although filled with stock phrases like other so-called autobiographies of the day, it outlines a life so full of adventure and incident that Gardner was left in awe of the man's energies. Wendy's story begins when, like the children of other province governors, he is sent from his family home at Abydos to Memphis and King Teti's court. Taking on relatively minor roles, he began a lifetime of service to the king, performing many of the duties his counterparts were serving in the royal temples of the time, where they were held, clothed, and fed the royal statues daily. The pharaoh's wife grew up in the palace, not with the state administration officials, but outside the immediate circle of the pharaoh's household. His rise in royal estimation can be gauged by the fact that King Titi's successor acknowledged him as one of his favorites. Pepi I charged him with conducting a discreet inquiry, without the involvement of any vizier or official of the state. Egyptian Egyptologists found and reconstructed other problems and trials in that court, by thinking that the state was punishing courtiers by covering up their names in their tomb chapels, and focusing on covering up courtiers' words in tomb chapels. Toward the end of a reign that spanned nearly half a century, Pepi I sent Weny to recruit a body of men from the kingdom and the Southlands to undertake no less than 6 expeditions into the South Levant following this in-house inquisition. Hieroglyphics appeared on the stone stela at this point. After scouring the land of the sand dwellers, this army returned safely, razing their land, overthrowing their walled settlements, and destroying their figs and vines. This army safely returned after destroying all the people's crops. His Majesty praised me for capturing thousands of troops and returning safely. It does not describe a war, despite the grandiloquence of the translation. As in most ancient Egyptian accounts of expeditions to quarries, mines, and regions outside the Lower Nile, this poem emphasizes both the danger of the enterprise and the safe return of the participants, while the numbers of the slain and captured and the damage done are greatly exaggerated, as is typical of such inscriptions. Human existence was more fragile than today, making laying large tracts of farmland bare or exterminating farmers impractical. Guess that Weny led caravans of men, carrying large quantities of supplies into the deserts of Sinai and Levant, where they pursued and punished sections of the native population, who, as other adventurers describe, probably hindered their progress. Afterward, these caravans appeared to travel further north into regions without central control or standing armies. Farms were raided, figs and vines stolen, and some walled settlements along their route were destroyed. Shortly after Pepi I's burial in his pyramid in 2310 BC, the new king Merenre assigned Weny a role. This sent him back to the various provinces where he had been born with several of his contemporaries. One of their contemporaries, a certain Ka, collected the grain tithes from the lower Nile Valley. Weny, on the other hand, was appointed to the newly created position of governor of the region between Aswan and Memphis, where he worked on constructing Merenre's monuments. He was responsible for quarrying and making cargo boats to ship Merenre's sarcophagus and the capstan of his pyramid from Nubia. During his time at Aswan, he supervised the quarrying of granite blocks for the temples and the construction of 5 slipways to allow boats to cross the cataracts safely. An excellent offering table was to be constructed out of blocks of alabaster from the desert quarries at Hatnub, and there he supervised the construction of a 100-foot barge to transport the stone. These tasks are similar to one that Weny's text says he asked King Sethi for while working as a courtier, following his instructions and following what other courtiers have written. A sarcophagus and some important parts of the tomb chapel's architecture would be cut from blocks of the best limestone from the Titular quarries and planned and sculpted in the royal workshops. Following his appointment as governor of the Nile Valley, many fine white stones and unique blocks bearing Weny's long inscription were transferred to the great plain of Abydos and installed within his immense mud-brick mastaba, which stood close to his father's monument on the vast desert that lies beyond the fields. The residence of Weny's household at Abydos appears to have been imposing. His new job away from the court may have been part of a late-stage change in Memphite society. At the same time as the vizier's administration, there was a parallel administration made up of men from the families of provincial headmen, who had close ties to the royal family and were in charge of getting food and supplies to the royal court. During the early years of Pepi II's reign, around 2390 BC, Weny died at an advanced age during national prosperity and population growth. Weny appears to have come from relatively humble origins, but he also controlled the resources of much of the lower Nile Valley at the end of his life, and had the personal means to build a lavish tomb on the desert plains of Abydos, close to the burial places of the first pharaohs. The prodigious tomb text portrays the man as a perfect courtier, demonstrating a lifelong, selfless devotion to the 3 kings he served. The best way to describe his profession is as a tireless organizer of various royal labor forces, desert caravans and labor gangs recruited from all over the kingdom and beyond to undertake expeditions, oversee work at desert quarries, and assist in the transport and shipment of the quarried blocks from Memphis to Abydos. No. We could not have accompanied the various Levantine excursions he had organized or supervised, or any other projects he describes in his text. While the text is very long and contains many praises and place names, it also includes a large number of elusive and formulaic expressions, which, along with the present lack of understanding of the order and functioning of the pharaonic court, make it difficult to assimilate the governor's long career into a contemporary one. In the last words of his excellent funerary text, the man describes himself best. "My father loved me, his mother praised me, and his brothers favored me." Osiris, the god of the south, venerated the senior courtier. Walled settlements along their route were destroyed. Shortly after Pepi II's burial in his pyramid, in 2310 BC, the new king Merenre assigned Weny a role. This sent him back to the various provinces where he had been born with several of his contemporaries. One of their contemporaries, a certain Ka, collected the grain tithes from the lower Nile Valley. Weny, on the other hand, was appointed to the newly created position of governor of the region between Aswan and Memphis, where he worked on constructing Merenre's monuments. He was responsible for quarrying and making cargo boats to ship Merenre's sarcophagus and the capstan of his pyramid from Nubia. During his time at Aswan, he supervised the quarrying of granite blocks for the temples and the construction of 5 slipways to allow boats to cross the cataracts safely. An excellent offering table was to be constructed out of blocks of alabaster from the desert quarries at Hatnub, and there he supervised the construction of a 100-foot barge to transport the stone. These tasks are similar to one that Weny's text says he asked King Sethi for while working as a courtier, following his instructions and following what other courtiers have written. A sarcophagus and some important parts of the tomb chapel's architecture would be cut from blocks of the best limestone from the Titular quarries and planned and sculpted in the royal workshops. Following his appointment as governor of the Nile Valley, many fine white stones and unique blocks bearing Weny's long inscription were transferred to the great plain of Abydos and installed within his immense mud-brick mastaba, which stood close to his father's monument on the vast desert that lies beyond the fields. The residence of Weny's household at Abydos appears to have been imposing. His new job away from the court may have been part of a late-stage change in Memphite society. At the same time as the vizier's administration, there was a parallel administration made up of men from the families of provincial headmen, who had close ties to the royal family and were in charge of getting food and supplies to the royal court. During the early years of Pepi II's reign, around 2390 BC, Weny died at an advanced age during national prosperity and population growth. Weny appears to have come from relatively humble origins, but he also controlled the resources of much of the lower Nile Valley at the end of his life, and had the personal means to build a lavish tomb on the desert plains of Abydos, close to the burial places of the first pharaohs. The prodigious tomb text portrays the man as a perfect courtier, demonstrating a lifelong, selfless devotion to the three kings he served. The best way to describe his profession is as a tireless organizer of various royal labor forces, desert caravans and labor gangs recruited from all over the kingdom and beyond to undertake expeditions, oversee work at desert quarries, and assist in the transport and shipment of the quarried blocks from Memphis to Abydos. No. We could not have accompanied the various Levantine excursions he had organized or supervised, or any other projects he describes in his text. While the text is very long and contains many praises and place names, it also includes a large number of elusive and formulaic expressions, which, along with the present lack of understanding of the order and functioning of the pharaonic court, make it difficult to assimilate the governor's long career into a contemporary one. In the last words of his excellent funerary text, the man describes himself best. "My father loved me, his mother praised me, and his brothers favored me." Osiris, the god of the south, venerated the senior courtier.